The freezing rain turned Robert Mitchell's world into a prison of ice and isolation. Torrential downpours had transformed the gentle creek behind his cabin into a raging monster that threatened to devour everything in its path. Power lines down, phone dead, radio crackling with evacuation warnings he could no longer heed. Then came the scratching, frantic, desperate, unmistakably alive, at his door. Robert grabbed his shotgun, hands trembling from more than just the cold. Outside, illuminated by lightning, stood a sight that defied all logic. A raccoon mother, soaked to the bone, clutching an injured cub while another huddled against her leg. Blood-smeared paw prints led to his porch. Their eyes met, hers dark with an intelligence that pierced his soul. She raised her paw against the glass, not in threat but in supplication. Something in those intelligent eyes made Robert break every rule he'd learned about wildlife. A decision that would change everything. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Mitchell hadn't always been a man who jumped at shadows. At 58, his weathered face told the story of a life lived hard, but with purpose. The silver at his temples had come early, during his time as a combat medic in the Gulf War. Some nights, when thunder rattled the windows of his cabin, he still woke up screaming, the ghost of desert sand in his mouth and the phantom scent of blood in his nostrils. The cabin itself was a legacy, his father's final gift. Thomas Mitchell had been something of a legend among wildlife biologists in this part of Oregon, spending decades documenting the coastal forest ecosystem. "Every creature has a purpose," the old man used to say, his voice now just an echo in the creaking wooden beams overhead. They hadn't spoken for 3 years before Thomas died in the flood of 13. Some wounds ran too deep for words to reach. Most days, Robert's only companions were the birds that visited his feeders, and the occasional deer that wandered through the clearing. His camera captured what his heart couldn't express, the raw beauty of a world that continued despite human suffering. The photographs he sold to nature magazines paid the bills, but barely. Since Linda's cancer took her 5 years ago, money seemed as meaningless as conversation. 30 miles of winding forest road separated Robert from the nearest town of Pinecrest. He made the journey only when absolutely necessary, for supplies or medication. The locals had stopped trying to draw him into community events or church socials. They called him the hermit photographer, with a mixture of respect and pity that made his skin crawl. "You can't hide from life forever," Linda had told him during those final, morphine-hazed days. But he wasn't hiding. He was preserving what little peace he'd managed to salvage from the wreckage of his memories. The cabin's isolation wasn't imprisonment, it was protection, for him and for others. Hank Wilson, whose property bordered Robert's to the north, was the closest thing he had to a neighbor. Their relationship existed in brief nods during chance encounters at the general store and occasional border disputes when Hank's hunting encroached too close to Robert's wildlife photography sites. "Those trash pandas are vermin," Hank had declared last summer, proudly displaying 3 raccoon pelts stretched on his porch, "carrying disease and stealing everything that ain't nailed down." Robert had said nothing then. His father would have launched into an impassioned defense of the raccoon's ecological importance. Instead, Robert had simply turned away. Another small betrayal of Thomas Mitchell's legacy added to his conscience. Now, standing at his door with rain lashing against the windows and a family of those same vermin seeking shelter, Robert faced a choice that felt strangely like redemption. His trembling hand moved from the shotgun to the door latch as lightning split the sky open, illuminating the desperate scene on his porch in stark, unforgiving detail. The storm had been building for days. Robert had watched it approach on his weather radio, tracking its progress with the methodical attention of someone whose survival depended on preparation. The meteorologist's voice crackled through static. Atmospheric river conditions, potential for catastrophic flooding, residents in low-lying areas advised to evacuate immediately. Robert's cabin sat on a modest rise, but the creek that normally babbled peacefully 30 yards from his back door had already swollen to twice its normal width. He'd spent the morning securing anything that might blow away, checking his generator and counting his medication, rituals that kept the anxiety at bay. The last major storm had taken out power for 11 days. The thought of 11 days alone in the dark with only his memories for company made his hands shake as he stacked firewood by the hearth. Just another storm, he muttered to himself, a mantra that had lost its reassuring power hours ago when the first trees began to bend like reeds in the wind. As dusk approached, the forest had gone eerily quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of deer through underbrush. Even the squirrels that normally chattered from the oak branches had disappeared. In their place came an unnatural stillness that raised the hair on Robert's neck, the wilderness equivalent of holding its breath. "Animals know," his father's voice echoed in his memory. "They feel the pressure change, sense the danger before our instruments can measure it. When the forest goes quiet, trouble's coming." The rain began not as a gentle patter, but as a sudden, violent assault. Sheets of water hammered the roof with such force that Robert feared the aging shingles might surrender. Wind howled through the trees, a banshee's wail that found every crack and crevice in the cabin's weathered frame. The temperature dropped rapidly as night fell, turning rain to something heavier, more dangerous, a freezing mix that coated branches with treacherous weight. Robert was checking the emergency radio again when he heard it. A sound so out of place, it stopped him mid-motion, a scratching at the door, deliberate and desperate, followed by a high-pitched chittering that raised goosebumps on his arms. His first instinct was caution. In 20 years of wildlife photography, he'd learned that desperate animals were unpredictable. The shotgun was more habit than intention as he approached the door, flashlight beam cutting through the condensation on the window. What the light revealed made him step back in surprise. A raccoon, female, large for her species, stared back at him with unnervingly direct eye contact. Her fur was matted with ice and something darker that the rain couldn't wash away: blood. At her feet huddled 2 cubs, one noticeably smaller than the other. The smaller one's hind leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the fur around it stained crimson. "Jesus Christ," Robert whispered, his breath fogging the glass. The mother raccoon placed a paw against the window, leaving a smeared red print. She chittered again, head swiveling between Robert and her injured young. Every wildlife training course, every handbook, every conversation with his father had emphasized one rule: never invite wild animals into human dwellings. It crossed a boundary that endangered both species. Wild animals stayed wild. Injured wildlife went to rehabilitators. These were the immutable laws of coexistence. Yet something about the raccoon's behavior defied explanation. The direct eye contact alone was unusual. Most raccoons avoided human interaction. This one seemed to be deliberately seeking it. "Go on, get!" Robert rapped his knuckles against the glass, expecting the family to scatter. The mother didn't move. If anything, she pressed closer to the door, shielding her cubs from the freezing rain with her body. The injured cub mewled pitifully, a sound that cut through Robert's practiced detachment. "Dad always said I had his hands but not his heart," Robert murmured. "Time to prove the old man wrong." With a sigh that carried the weight of professional judgment cast aside, Robert turned the deadbolt. The wind nearly ripped the door from his grasp as he opened it, just wide enough to assess the situation from the threshold. Up close, The raccoon mother's condition was worse than he'd thought. A matted patch of fur on her shoulder revealed what looked disturbingly like a gunshot wound, partially healed but badly infected. Hank's doing, most likely. Despite her injury, she stood protectively over her cubs, eyes never leaving Robert's face. "I can't take you to a rehabilitator in this weather," Robert said, voice rough from disuse. "And you won't last the night out here." The decision felt simultaneously reckless and inevitable. Robert stepped back, making space in the doorway. "Come on, then. Utility room only. Don't make me regret this." To his astonishment, the mother raccoon seemed to understand. With careful movements, she nudged the healthy cub through the doorway, then gently gripped the injured one by the scruff of its neck. The tenderness of the gesture made something twist in Robert's chest, a feeling he recognized as compassion, long dormant but not extinct. The utility room off the kitchen was small but warm, housing the washer, dryer, and storage shelves stocked with supplies. Robert quickly cleared a space, laying down old towels to create a makeshift nest. He filled a shallow bowl with water and placed it in the corner, then retreated to give the family space. Through the doorway, he watched as the mother raccoon inspected the area with methodical thoroughness. She tested the towels with her paws, sniffed the water cautiously, and explored each corner before finally settling her cubs in the warmest spot near the dryer vent. Her movements were deliberate, almost human in their assessment. "In 40 years of studying wildlife, I'd never seen anything like it," Robert later wrote in the journal he'd started that night. "She wasn't just allowing my help, she was participating." With the raccoon family settled, Robert gathered his limited medical supplies. His military medic training had emphasized human anatomy, but the principles of wound care remained the same across species. Infection was infection. Pain was pain. Approaching slowly, first aid kit in hand, Robert knelt at a respectful distance. "I need to check that leg," he told the mother raccoon, knowing she couldn't understand his words, but hoping his tone conveyed peaceful intentions. "And that shoulder of yours needs cleaning, too." The mother raccoon watched him warily but made no move to attack or flee. When Robert extended his hand, palm up and empty, she stretched her neck to sniff his fingers. Her whiskers tickled his skin, a delicate sensation that contrasted with the intensity of her gaze. What happened next would be the first of many moments that challenged Robert's understanding of wildlife behavior. The mother raccoon gently nudged her injured cub toward him, then shuffled backward, creating space for Robert to work. It was a gesture of trust so profound it momentarily took his breath away. "Okay then," Robert whispered, voice thick with emotion he couldn't name. "Let's see what we've got here." The storm raged outside, transforming the forest into a maelstrom of wind and freezing rain. Trees groaned under the weight of ice, and the creek rose inch by inexorable inch. But inside the cabin, in a utility room never meant for such purpose, Robert Mitchell found himself serving as doctor to a family that, by all natural laws, should have feared him. As he carefully cleaned the cub's fractured leg and splinted it with popsicle sticks and gauze, Robert felt something long dormant awakening inside him, a sense of purpose that had been missing since he'd packed away his military medical kit. The mother raccoon watched his every move, occasionally chittering soft encouragement to her cub when the pain caused it to squirm. "You're doing just fine," Robert found himself saying, the bedside manner he'd once used with wounded soldiers returning naturally. "Just a little more, buddy. Almost done." By the time Robert turned his attention to the mother's shoulder wound, extracting what was definitely a small-caliber bullet fragment, the storm had reached its full fury. The cabin creaked and shuddered around them, but within the utility room, a fragile peace had been established, one built on necessity and a strange, unspoken understanding. As Robert finally closed his medical kit, exhaustion washing over him, the mother raccoon did something that would haunt his thoughts for days to come. She placed her paw, briefly but deliberately, on the back of his hand. The gesture lasted only seconds, but its meaning transcended language. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or gratitude. "You're welcome," Robert said softly, retreating to give the family space to rest. "I guess we're all just trying to survive the storm." He didn't know then how prophetic those words would prove to be. Dawn brought no relief from the storm's fury. If anything, the situation had deteriorated overnight. Robert woke to the sound of water, not the familiar patter of rain on the roof, but the more ominous gurgle of rising floodwater against the foundation. A quick check of the basement revealed 3 inches of muddy water already seeping through the concrete, the pump working overtime to keep pace. "Not good," Robert muttered, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The weather radio confirmed his fears. The storm had stalled over the coastal range, dumping unprecedented rainfall. Flash flood warnings had been upgraded to emergency status. Roads were washing out across the county. He filled a mug with instant coffee, wincing at the bitter taste. The power had flickered throughout the night but remained on, a small mercy that might not last. Through the kitchen window, Robert could see the creek had breached its banks, spreading across the lower portion of his property in a sheet of angry brown water. The distance between flood and cabin had shrunk from 30 yards to perhaps 15. His morning medication routine was interrupted by a soft chittering from the utility room. The Raccoon family. In the chaos of the storm and evacuation warnings, he'd almost forgotten his unusual house guests. Robert approached the doorway cautiously, unsure what to expect. The mother raccoon, he'd started thinking of her as Clara sometime during the night, was already awake, grooming her healthy cub while keeping a watchful eye on the injured one. The makeshift splint had held, but the smaller cub's breathing seemed labored, its tiny body shivering despite the towels. "Fever," Robert diagnosed, professional concern overriding his caution. Infection was setting in, likely from whatever had caused the leg injury in the first place. Clara watched intently as Robert examined her cub, chittering softly when he gently felt the small body for heat and swelling. The infection was spreading. Without antibiotics, the prognosis wasn't good. "I've got some stuff that might help," Robert told her, aware of the absurdity of conversing with a wild animal yet unable to stop himself. Not designed for raccoons, but better than nothing. His military medic kit contained broad-spectrum antibiotics, technically prescribed for his own use in emergencies, but he'd never needed them. Dosing would be guesswork. Too much could be as dangerous as the infection itself. While calculating the proper dilution, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the cabin to its foundations. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Generators should have kicked in automatically, but the reassuring hum didn't follow. "Damn it!" The sudden darkness triggered a response Robert couldn't control. His heart rate spiked, sweat breaking out across his forehead as the thunder rolled again. Not thunder, artillery, not rain, but shells falling, not Oregon, but desert sand beneath his boots. The pill bottle slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, scattering tiny white tablets across the kitchen floor. His breathing came in short, painful gasps. The world narrowed to a pinpoint, the present fading as the past rushed in with terrible clarity. "No, no, no!" Robert gripped the counter, fighting to stay anchored to reality. "Not now." PTSD episodes had become less frequent over the years, but stress and triggers, like sudden darkness and sounds resembling explosions, could still send him spiraling. Without his medication, the flashbacks seized him with merciless intensity. Sand everywhere, blood on his hands. The boy, not older than 12, intestines spilling through fingers that couldn't possibly hold them in place. "Stay with me. Stay with me," Robert heard himself saying, but the words came from years ago, addressed to a patient long dead in a desert far away. A sharp pain on his ankle snapped him back to the present. Something was tugging at his pant leg. Robert blinked rapidly, vision clearing to reveal Clara standing upright beside him, front paws pulling insistently at his jeans. The bizarre sight was so unexpected that it momentarily short-circuited his panic. "What the?" The raccoon released his pant leg and scurried a few feet away, then looked back expectantly. When Robert didn't move, she returned and repeated the tugging, more urgently this time. "You want me to follow you?" The question came automatically, the absurdity of the situation briefly overshadowing his anxiety. Clara moved toward the scattered pills, sniffing them carefully before picking one up in her dexterous front paws. To Robert's astonishment, she brought the pill back to him, holding it up like an offering. That's... Robert struggled to process what he was seeing. "Thank you." His hands still trembled as he retrieved a glass of water and swallowed the medication. By the time he'd collected himself enough to check on the injured cub, the floodwater outside had risen to half a meter, covering the first step of the porch. The generator remained silent, likely swamped by water in the shed. The utility room had become an island of calm amid the chaos. Clara had gathered both cubs into a tight ball of fur, the healthy one, whom Robert had mentally dubbed Scout, providing warmth to Patch, the injured cub who seemed weaker by the hour. Robert prepared the diluted antibiotic with careful precision, drawing it into a small oral syringe. "This won't taste good," he warned, kneeling beside the raccoon family, "but it might save his life." Clara's reaction defied everything Robert understood about wild animal behavior. Instead of becoming defensive when he reached for her cub, she gently maneuvered Patch's head, exposing his mouth to make Robert's task easier. The level of comprehension displayed was unsettling in its clarity. "If you'd told me a wild raccoon would be the one to talk me down from a panic attack, I'd have called you crazy," Robert murmured as he administered the medicine. Yet there she was, her paw on my trembling hand, chirping softly until my breathing steadied. The next few hours established a strange partnership between man and raccoon. With the power out and storm intensifying, Robert focused on moving essential supplies to the second floor. Each time he passed the utility room, Clara watched him with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. Once, when another crash of thunder triggered a momentary flashback, he returned to awareness to find her sitting beside him, paw resting lightly on his knee. Scout, the healthy cub, proved remarkably adventurous once he'd recovered from the initial shock of human proximity. Robert caught him investigating the contents of lower cupboards, manipulating doorknobs with surprising dexterity, and studying the emergency radio with head tilted in apparent curiosity. "Your dad would have lost his mind over this," Robert told Clara, who was supervising Scout's explorations from the doorway. "Always said raccoons were the primates of North America." By mid-afternoon, the flood had claimed the entire first porch step and was working on the second. The rain continued unabated, driven sideways by wind that howled like a living thing. Robert's attempts to reach emergency services via hand-crank radio yielded only static, the airwaves as swamped as the landscape. A particularly violent gust slammed something heavy against the side of the cabin, the impact causing a shelf of books to topple in the living room. Clara reacted immediately, vocalizing a warning chirp that sent Scout scurrying back to the utility room. Her behavior wasn't that of a wild animal seeking shelter, it was that of a thinking being, assessing danger and responding appropriately. As Robert righted the bookshelf, a water-stained journal caught his eye. His father's handwriting filled the pages, meticulous observations of local wildlife spanning decades. Robert had never bothered to read through Thomas's research after inheriting the cabin, a neglect that now felt like yet another betrayal. Curiosity piqued. He flipped through the weathered pages. Midway through the journal, something stopped him cold. A detailed sketch of a raccoon with distinctive markings. A white patch on the right ear and unusual rings on the tail, markings identical to Clara's. "No way," Robert whispered, checking the date. The entry was from 15 years ago. Further reading revealed his father had documented multiple generations of raccoons in this area, noting unusual problem-solving abilities and social behaviors. Thomas had theorized that the isolated valley fostered higher intelligence over successive generations, particularly in raccoons, whose natural dexterity and adaptability gave them advantages. The female with the white patched ear demonstrates remarkable cognitive capabilities, Thomas had written. She has not only mastered the puzzle boxes but appears to be teaching techniques to her offspring. This suggests a level of cultural transmission previously undocumented in Procyon Lotor. Robert glanced toward the utility room where Clara was meticulously cleaning Patch's splinted leg. Could she be a descendant of the raccoons his father studied? The timing and distinctive markings suggested a connection that stretched credulity yet explained the inexplicable behavior he'd witnessed. "Dad wasn't crazy after all," Robert murmured, turning pages with newfound reverence. What everyone dismissed as an old man's obsession was scientific discovery. His exploration was interrupted by a sound that chilled his blood more effectively than the rising flood, the unmistakable crack of a structural beam giving way somewhere beneath the cabin. The floor shuddered perceptibly, listing slightly toward the creek side. At that moment, the hand-crank radio sputtered to life with an emergency broadcast. "Repeat. All residents in Pinecrest Valley must evacuate immediately. Dam officials report the West Ridge Reservoir is at critical levels. Structural failure is possible within hours. This is not a drill." Robert's heart sank as he processed the implications. If the West Ridge Dam failed, the resulting surge would transform the already dangerous flood into a devastating wall of water. The cabin, already compromised, wouldn't stand a chance. Clara appeared in the doorway, chittering urgently. She moved to the window facing the creek, paws against the glass as she stared at the rising water. The intelligence in that gesture, the apparent understanding of their shared predicament, sent a shiver down Robert's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "We need to leave," he told her, gathering emergency supplies into a backpack. "But I don't know if you'll come with me or if I should even try to take you." The ethical dilemma of removing wild animals from their habitat warred with the imminent danger. Interfering with wildlife was against everything he believed. Yet leaving them to drown contradicted something deeper, more fundamental to his humanity. As if sensing his conflict, Clara returned to the utility room and began gently nosing Patch to his feet. The injured cub wobbled unsteadily, clearly still weak, but marginally improved from the antibiotics. Scout chittered excitedly, circling his mother and sibling. Robert watched in amazement as Clara herded both cubs toward the stairs, pausing at the bottom step to look back at him expectantly. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "Guess that decides it." Another ominous crack from below emphasized the urgency of their situation. Robert quickly gathered the remaining essentials: medication, radio, his father's journal, and what food he could carry. The flood had claimed the third step now, water beginning to seep under the front door in a thin, inexorable stream. The Raccoon family waited at the top of the stairs, Clara's eyes never leaving Robert as he made his final preparations. In them, he saw something that transcended the traditional boundaries between human and wild. A mutual recognition of intelligence, of shared danger, and perhaps most surprisingly, of trust. "Let's go then," Robert said, shouldering his pack. "Together." The decision to help the raccoons had become something more significant than an act of compassion. It had become a choice to honor his father's work, to redeem his own failures of understanding, and to embrace a connection with the natural world that went beyond observation to participation. As they moved to the second floor, Robert couldn't know how this strange partnership would develop or what awaited them as the storm continued its relentless assault. But for the first time in years, the former combat medic felt something like purpose returning, a reason to face the dangers ahead with resolve rather than resignation. Somewhere in the cabin's creaking timbers, he could almost hear his father's approving voice. Every creature deserves compassion. Sometimes that's all that stands between survival and surrender. Night fell upon the cabin like a shroud, the darkness broken only by the weak beam of Robert's flashlight and occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the floodwaters below. From the second-floor window he watched the creek, now a raging river, devour more of his property with each passing hour. The rain continued its relentless assault, driven by winds that made the old cabin groan in protest. Robert had converted his bedroom into a temporary sanctuary, pushing furniture against the walls to create open floor space. Clara and her cubs occupied the corner furthest from the window, nestled in a makeshift den of blankets and towels. The raccoon mother's vigilance hadn't wavered. Her eyes reflected the flashlight beam whenever Robert moved about the room, tracking his every action with unmistakable awareness. "Water levels at 30 inches and rising," Robert noted aloud, more for his own benefit than for his unusual companions'. Speaking helped anchor him to reality, keeping the flashbacks at bay. "If the dam holds, we might be okay up here. If it doesn't—" He left the thought unfinished. The West Ridge Dam had been built in the 1950s, its concrete aging, maintenance perpetually underfunded. Local environmental groups had warned about its structural integrity for years, but bureaucratic inertia prevailed until crisis struck. Now they were all paying the price of postponed action. Robert checked his watch. 9:37 p.m. The handheld radio remained ominously silent, its batteries conserved for emergency broadcasts. The isolation felt absolute, as though the storm had swallowed the entire world, leaving only this fragile island of existence. Turning his attention to his patients, Robert approached the raccoon family with slow, deliberate movements. Patch, the injured cub, showed modest improvement. The antibiotics had reduced his fever, and the splinted leg appeared to be holding properly. Scout curled protectively around his sibling, offering warmth and comfort that medicine couldn't provide. "Let's have a look at you," Robert murmured, kneeling beside them. Clara watched intently as Robert examined Patch, chittering softly when he carefully felt for signs of continued infection. To his amazement, she extended her paw toward the first aid kit, tapping it with unmistakable purpose. "You want me to use this again?" Robert asked, unable to suppress his wonder at her apparent comprehension. He opened the kit, displaying its contents. Clara immediately nudged the antibiotic cream with her nose, then looked pointedly at her cub's leg. The gesture was so deliberate, so human in its communicative intent, that Robert felt a chill run down his spine. "Your dad would have documented every second of this," he told Clara, applying the cream as directed. "Probably would have had his research published by now, changing everything we think we know about animal intelligence." As he worked, Robert's thoughts drifted to his father. Thomas Mitchell had been right about so many things: the intelligence of these animals, the fragility of the ecosystem, even the danger of the aging dam. The community had dismissed him as an eccentric old man, too long in the woods alone. Robert himself had contributed to that dismissal, embarrassed by his father's passionate advocacy and unconventional theories. "I should have listened," he admitted to the empty room, to the ghosts of his past, to the attentive raccoon watching him work. "Should have read his journals before now." After tending to Patch, Robert returned to his father's weather-beaten journal, poring over entries by flashlight. The pages revealed a methodical documentation of the local raccoon population spanning decades. Thomas had recorded multiple generations, noting distinctive markings and behaviors that allowed him to track family lines. According to his observations, Clara's likely grandmother had demonstrated unprecedented problem-solving abilities, which appeared to be passed down and enhanced in subsequent generations. Cultural transmission, Thomas had written. These raccoons aren't just learning through individual experience, but are actively teaching their young. The implications are staggering. The journal contained detailed sketches of custom puzzle boxes Thomas had constructed to test raccoon intelligence, along with success rates that improved dramatically across generations. He'd documented tool use, cooperative problem-solving, and even rudimentary symbolic communication through visual cues. Robert closed the journal, overwhelmed by the implications and by his own failure to appreciate his father's work while Thomas was alive. Their last conversation had been an argument about this very research, Robert dismissing it as anthropomorphic fantasy, Thomas insisting that science was missing something fundamental about animal cognition. "You were right, Dad," Robert whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't see it." A sudden crackle from the radio pulled Robert from his reverie. The emergency broadcast cut through static. "Attention all residents in Pinecrest Valley and surrounding areas. West Ridge Dam showing signs of increased stress. Officials are implementing emergency release protocols to reduce pressure. Residents should prepare for additional water level increases of 1 to 2 feet within the next 3 to 4 hours. Remain on high ground. Repeat." Robert calculated quickly. The cabin's second floor stood approximately 10 feet above the current water level. If the dam held and the controlled release worked as intended, they would remain above the flood. If it failed completely... A sharp chittering from Clara interrupted his thoughts. The raccoon had moved to the window, standing upright with her front paws against the glass. Her posture was alert, head tilted as if listening to something beyond human perception. "What is it?" Robert joined her at the window, scanning the darkness. At first he saw nothing but rain and roiling water. Then a flash of lightning illuminated a figure on the ridge across the creek, a human figure, moving carefully along the higher ground. The silhouette was unmistakable. Hank Wilson, rifle slung over his shoulder, making his way toward the cabin. "Well, I'll be damned," Robert muttered. "Old Hank's checking on me." The relationship between the two men had always been complicated. Neighbors by geography but separated by philosophy, they maintained a cold civility punctuated by occasional heated disputes over hunting and conservation. Hank considered himself a traditionalist. Nature existed to be used, animals to be managed or harvested. Robert, following his father's footsteps even while denying the connection, saw himself as nature's chronicler rather than its controller. Yet here was Hank, risking treacherous conditions to check on a neighbor he barely tolerated. The gesture stirred something in Robert's chest, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended their differences. Clara, however, had a markedly different reaction to Hank's approach. She retreated from the window, gathering her cubs with urgent vocalizations that Robert interpreted as alarm. Her behavior shifted from the calm, cooperative demeanor she'd shown with him to something more wild, more fearful. The reason clicked into place with sickening clarity. Clara's shoulder wound, the bullet Robert had extracted. Hank's proud display of raccoon pelts last summer. The connection was undeniable. "He shot you," Robert said quietly. "Probably thought he'd killed you." Clara's intelligent eyes met his, and in that moment Robert felt the weight of a choice he hadn't fully processed until now. By helping these animals, these specific animals, he had taken a side in a conflict that extended beyond philosophical disagreement. He had chosen to protect what Hank would destroy. As Hank made his laborious way around the flooded perimeter, eventually reaching the relative high ground near the cabin's front access, Robert faced a decision. Revealing Clara's presence might jeopardize her safety. Concealing it felt like deception toward a man who had braved dangerous conditions out of concern, however gruff that concern might be. The sharp rap of knuckles on the downstairs doorframe settled the matter, at least temporarily. Water had breached the first floor, but the elevated entryway remained accessible. "Mitchell, you alive in there?" Hank's voice carried over the storm's constant roar. "Upstairs?" Robert called back. "Door's unlocked, but there's 2 feet of water on the first floor." He turned to Clara, who had retreated to the farthest corner with her cubs. "Stay here," he whispered, unsure if she understood but feeling compelled to communicate his intent. "I won't let him find you." Robert descended the stairs cautiously, the water line reaching midway up the staircase. The beam of his flashlight reflected off the murky floodwater that had claimed his living room, kitchen, and the utility room where he'd first sheltered the Raccoon family. Family photos floated among debris, his father's books swollen with moisture, a lifetime of possessions surrendered to the relentless water. Hank stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hunting jacket, his weathered face lined with concern beneath the brim of his soaked cap. At 65, he moved with the stiffness of a man who had spent decades working the land, his body documenting every fence post driven and tree felled. "Damn, Mitchell, place is halfway to becoming a houseboat." Hank surveyed the damage with a professional eye. "Ridge Road's still passable. Got my truck parked up top. Was heading to the emergency shelter in town when I saw your lights." "Appreciate you checking," Robert replied, genuine despite their differences. "I'm set up okay upstairs for now. Radio says they're doing controlled releases at the dam." Hank snorted. "Ain't nothing controlled about this situation. That dam's been a disaster waiting to happen since '98. Your daddy was right about that, at least." The unexpected acknowledgement of Thomas Mitchell's foresight caught Robert off guard. "You never seem to agree with Dad about much of anything." "Disagreeing with a man don't mean you can't respect when he's right." Hank shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the admission. "Listen, you should clear out while you still can. This cabin's old. Foundation wasn't built for standing in water this long." As if to emphasize his point, a low groan emanated from somewhere beneath them, the structure protesting its unnatural immersion. "I can't leave yet," Robert said, the words emerging before he'd fully considered their implications. "Got some responsibilities here." Hank's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What kind of responsibilities keep a man in a flooding house?" Before Robert could formulate a response, a soft thud from upstairs drew both men's attention. Scout, the curious cub, had apparently knocked something over in his explorations. "You got someone else up there?" Hank asked, hand instinctively moving toward the rifle slung across his back. "No," Robert answered too quickly. "Just some supplies shifting. Place is settling in the flood." Hank didn't appear convinced. Years of hunting had honed his ability to distinguish between natural sounds and those made by living creatures. "Mitchell, what aren't you telling me?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Robert weighed his options, calculating risks and outcomes with the precision he'd once applied to battlefield triage. Lying outright would only increase suspicion. A partial truth might satisfy curiosity without endangering Clara and her cubs. "I found some injured wildlife," Robert admitted carefully. "Been treating them. Can't move them yet." Hank's expression darkened. "Wildlife? What kind?" Another structural groan saved Robert from immediate response, this one louder and accompanied by a noticeable shift in the floor beneath them. Water began seeping through new cracks, the rate of incursion increasing visibly. "That don't sound good," Hank observed, momentarily distracted from his questioning. "This place was built by your grandfather, wasn't it? Old construction techniques weren't made for these kinds of conditions." Robert nodded, grateful for the change in subject. 1937. Good bones, but even good bones have their limits. The momentary reprieve ended when Clara appeared at the top of the stairs, Scout peeking from between her legs. The Raccoon family had abandoned their hiding place, perhaps driven by the ominous sounds of structural failure. Hank's reaction was immediate and predictable. "Goddamn trash pandas!" His hand moved to his rifle, the motion fluid with decades of practice. "That's what you're risking your life for?" Robert positioned himself between Hank and the staircase, hands raised placatingly. "They're injured. The mother was shot." He stopped himself from adding "by you," but the accusation hung unspoken between them. "The cub has a broken leg." "I couldn't just leave them to drown." "Those vermin destroy property, spread disease," Hank countered, his voice rising with incredulity. "You've lost your mind letting them in your home." Clara watched the exchange from her elevated position, her intelligent eyes moving between the two men. Rather than retreating from Hank's hostile presence, she stood her ground, protecting her cubs while assessing the situation with unnerving awareness. "They're not ordinary animals," Robert insisted, echoing his father's words from the journal. "Look at her behavior, the way she's watching us, understanding us. My father spent 30 years proving what I've seen in 3 days." Hank's laugh held no humor. "Your old man was touched in the head about these critters." Talking about raccoon intelligence and cultural learning, made himself the laughingstock of the county. The dismissal stung, reopening old wounds of embarrassment and shame that Robert had felt about his father's passionate advocacy. But now, with Clara's knowing gaze upon him, those feelings transformed into something else, a fierce determination to vindicate Thomas Mitchell's work. "Dad was right," Robert stated firmly. "These raccoons demonstrate problem-solving abilities far beyond what science currently acknowledges. They use tools, they teach their young, they communicate in sophisticated ways." "They're animals, Mitchell." Hank's tone suggested he was questioning not just Robert's judgment but his sanity. "Smart for animals, sure, but still just animals." As the men argued, Clara made a decision of her own. She descended several steps, still out of Hank's reach but close enough to be clearly visible in the flashlight beam. Deliberately, with movements that could not be mistaken for random animal behavior, she placed her front paws on the railing and emitted a series of soft, complex vocalizations. Scout responded immediately, retreating up the stairs to where Patch remained. Clara then turned her attention to the men, particularly Hank, meeting his gaze with unblinking intensity. "See that?" Robert whispered, awed despite his familiarity with Clara's unusual behavior. "That's not normal raccoon behavior. That's communication, planning, assessment." Hank's expression wavered between ingrained skepticism and reluctant fascination. "Plenty of animals are smart enough to surprise people. Don't make them special." "Read my father's journals," Robert urged. 30 years of documentation, multiple generations, showing increasing cognitive abilities. "This isn't just animal intelligence. It's something we've barely begun to understand." Before Hank could respond, Clara abruptly turned her attention to the ceiling, ears perked forward in alert. A second later, a tremendous crack reverberated through the cabin, followed by a shower of dust and debris from above. "Roof's going!" Hank shouted, backing toward the door. "We need to clear out now!" Clara bolted up the stairs with remarkable speed, disappearing from view. Robert hesitated, torn between immediate evacuation and ensuring the Raccoon family's safety. "Mitchell, don't be a fool," Hank called from the doorway. "No animal is worth dying for." Another crack, louder than the first, made the decision for him. "Get to your truck," Robert shouted back. "I'll meet you there with them." Without waiting for Hank's protest, Robert charged up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time despite the water now flowing down from above, a sign that the roof had indeed breached. The bedroom where he'd left the raccoons was in chaos, rain pouring through a jagged hole in the ceiling, wind whipping through the exposed interior. Clara had already gathered her cubs, nudging them toward the hallway with urgent chittering. Scout moved willingly, but Patch struggled with his injured leg, progress painfully slow. "Come on," Robert urged, scooping up the injured cub despite knowing the risk of handling a wild animal, even a juvenile one. To his surprise, Patch didn't resist, instead curling into Robert's protective grasp. Clara acknowledged the assistance with a quick glance, then led the way down the hall toward the back bedroom, the one that had been Thomas Mitchell's, preserved largely untouched since his death. Robert followed, trusting her instinct even as the cabin continued to groan and shift beneath them. The back bedroom appeared intact, its roof still holding against the storm's assault. Clara moved purposefully toward the window, placing her paws against the glass and looking out toward the hillside beyond, the direction opposite from where Hank waited with his truck. "You don't trust him," Robert realized aloud. "And you know another way out." Whether she understood his words or simply his intent, Clara's response was clear. She moved to an old roll-top desk in the corner, his father's primary workspace, and began pulling at one of the drawers with remarkable dexterity. Robert assisted, sliding open the drawer to reveal a collection of maps, handwritten notes, and a set of keys he didn't recognize. Beneath these lay a waterproof case containing what appeared to be backup drives and memory cards, carefully labeled in his father's meticulous handwriting. "Dad's research," Robert breathed, understanding the significance immediately. All of Thomas Mitchell's documentation, his life's work, preserved in digital format, including presumably his observations of Clara's family line. The cabin shuddered again, a more violent movement that sent books tumbling from shelves. Time was running out. Robert quickly secured the waterproof case in his pack, then turned his attention to escape. "Hank's waiting out front with a truck," he told Clara, unsure how much she comprehended but feeling compelled to communicate. "But you don't want to go that way, do you?" Clara's answering chitter seemed almost like confirmation. She moved back to the window, pawing at the latch with surprising precision. Robert understood. "You know somewhere safe nearby, somewhere uphill." Opening the window released a torrent of wind and rain into the room. Beyond, barely visible through the storm, lay the forested hillside rising behind the cabin, steep, rugged terrain that Robert knew continued upward for nearly a mile before reaching an old fire road. If Clara was indicating that route as an escape path, she had a far better understanding of local geography than any wild animal should. The decision confronting Robert carried enormous weight. Follow Hank's route to certain safety, subjecting Clara and her cubs to a man who had already tried to kill them once, or trust this extraordinary animal's guidance into treacherous wilderness during the worst storm in decades. For a moment, he saw his father standing at this same window years ago, making similar choices that the community had ridiculed and that Robert himself had dismissed as eccentric obsession. The parallel was unmistakable, the opportunity for redemption clear. "Your way, then," Robert decided, securing his backpack and gathering the still compliant Patch. "Lead on." As if understanding the significance of his choice, Clara placed her paw briefly on Robert's hand, the same gesture of connection she'd offered earlier. Then, with Scout close behind, she slipped through the window into the howling night, embarking on a journey that would challenge everything Robert thought he knew about the boundaries between human and wild. The world beyond the window was chaos incarnate. Rain fell in horizontal sheets, driven by winds that bent saplings double and tore branches from century-old firs. Lightning split the sky in jagged bursts, illuminating the landscape in stark, otherworldly flashes that burned afterimages onto Robert's retinas. Each thunderclap rattled his bones, threatening to trigger another episode, but the weight of Patch in his arms kept him anchored to the present. Clara moved with surprising confidence through the tempest, her ringed tail visible even in the darkness as she paused frequently to ensure Robert and Scout followed. The small, healthy cub stayed close to his mother, occasionally glancing back as if checking on his injured sibling. Their path wound upward through dense underbrush, avoiding the steepest slopes where mudslides had already scarred the hillside. Robert struggled to keep pace, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he cradled Patch against his chest. Years of relative inactivity had taken their toll. The former combat medic, who once carried wounded soldiers across desert terrain, now found himself winded after 100 yards of uphill climbing. Yet stopping wasn't an option. Behind them, the groaning of the cabin had given way to a series of sharp cracks that could only mean catastrophic structural failure. "Mitchell?" Hank's voice carried faintly through the storm, barely audible over the wind's howl. "Where the hell are you?" Robert hesitated, a twinge of guilt piercing through his determination. Hank had risked his life to check on a neighbor he barely tolerated. Abandoning him without explanation felt like a betrayal of that unexpected decency. Clara sensed his hesitation. She circled back, chittering urgently, front paws pulling at his sodden pant leg. Her message couldn't have been clearer had she spoken. "Keep moving. Now." The decision was made for him when a tremendous crash echoed from below, the unmistakable sound of the cabin finally surrendering to the flood. Robert turned to see the roof collapse in slow motion, the structure folding in on itself like a house of cards, generations of Mitchell family history consumed by water and wind in mere seconds. "Dear God," he whispered, momentarily frozen by the sight. Hank appeared at the edge of the devastation, flashlight beams sweeping frantically across the wreckage. "Mitchell!" His shout held genuine fear now, the concern of one human for another transcending their differences. Robert raised his free arm, ready to signal his position, when Clara made a sound he hadn't heard before, a sharp, warning bark that froze him mid-motion. She stared at him with fierce intensity, then deliberately looked toward the hillside above the cabin. Following her gaze, Robert saw what had triggered her alarm. The saturated earth was moving, a massive section of hillside beginning to slump downward in the early stages of what would become a catastrophic mudslide. Its path would take it directly through Hank's position. "Hank!" Robert shouted, voice breaking with urgency. "The hill! Get back!" Whether Hank heard him over the storm's fury was impossible to tell. Robert took an instinctive step downhill toward danger before Clara blocked his path. She stood upright, paws pressed against his legs, chittering with unmistakable desperation. Scout added his voice to hers, the combined vocalizations carrying a message that transcended species. "You cannot help him this way." The hillside's movement accelerated, a rippling wave of mud, vegetation, and debris gathering speed as it descended toward the ruined cabin. Robert watched in helpless horror, certain he was witnessing Hank's last moments. Then, a miracle. Hank looked up, perhaps alerted by some sixth sense born from decades in these mountains. He spotted the approaching slide and bolted toward his truck, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. The mud missed him by mere feet, engulfing the cabin ruins instead in a churning mass of destruction. "He made it," Robert breathed, relief washing through him as Hank's truck headlights cut through the darkness, moving away along the ridge road. "He's safe." Clara relaxed her blocking posture, returning to all fours with what seemed like her own sigh of relief. She resumed their upward journey immediately, more urgently now, as if understanding that the earth beneath them had become as dangerous as the water below. They climbed in silence, broken only by the storm's continued rage and Robert's labored breathing. Patch remained surprisingly calm in his arms, the raccoon cub's natural fear of humans apparently overridden by pain, exhaustion, and perhaps some inherited understanding that this particular human meant safety rather than threat. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes of steady climbing, the terrain leveled slightly. They had reached a natural bench in the hillside where a fallen old-growth cedar created a partial shelter from the wind and rain. Clara led them beneath the massive trunk, into a space formed by the upturned root system and the surrounding earth. To Robert's astonishment, the area showed signs of preparation. Dry leaves and pine needles had been gathered into a nest-like formation. Small branches were arranged to divert water flow around rather than through the space. Most surprisingly, fragments of tarp, likely blown from campsites over the years, had been woven among branches to create a crude but effective roof. "You knew this was here," Robert said, carefully setting Patch down in the driest section of the shelter. "You prepared this place." Clara didn't respond directly, of course, but she immediately began adjusting the nest materials, creating a more suitable bed for her injured cub. Scout helped, demonstrating remarkable coordination for an animal so young as he dragged additional dry leaves into position. Robert sank down against the cedar trunk, exhaustion catching up to him all at once. His clothes were soaked through, chilling him despite the exertion of the climb. The pack containing his father's research and what few supplies he'd managed to grab weighed against his back, a physical reminder of all that had been preserved and all that had been lost. "Your dad would have documented every second of this," he told Clara, who was now grooming Patch with methodical care. "Probably would have had a better emergency plan, too." The raccoon paused in her ministrations, regarding Robert with what he could only interpret as understanding. She then moved to the edge of their shelter, peering out into the storm before disappearing briefly into the darkness. When she returned moments later, she carried something in her mouth, a small, dark object that she placed deliberately at Robert's feet. It was a blackberry, rain-washed but intact. The simple offering stunned Robert into silence. This wasn't the behavior of a wild animal seeking shelter from a storm. This was something else entirely, a gesture of reciprocity, of shared resources, of connection that transcended the traditional boundaries between human and wild. "Thank you," he finally managed, voice thick with emotion he couldn't fully name. Clara returned to her cubs, curling around them for warmth as the storm continued its assault on the world beyond their fragile shelter. Robert ate the berry, its tart sweetness exploding on his tongue, the simple pleasure somehow magnified by the extraordinary circumstances of its offering. As the adrenaline of their escape faded, the reality of their situation settled heavily upon Robert's shoulders. The cabin was gone, not just damaged but utterly destroyed. With it had gone most of his possessions, his medication, his connection to emergency services. They were stranded on a mountainside in a historic storm, miles from the nearest road accessible in these conditions. The rational part of Robert's mind calculated their chances with military precision. Exposure was the immediate threat. Despite the relative protection of their shelter, his wet clothing would leach body heat until hypothermia set in. Food was a secondary concern, water paradoxically a third, despite its overwhelming presence in the landscape. If the storm continued for another day, as forecasts had predicted, their odds of survival diminished with each passing hour. Yet amid these grim calculations, Robert found himself strangely calm. The panic attacks that had plagued him for years seemed distant, held at bay by the immediate demands of survival and by the odd sense of purpose he'd found in protecting this remarkable raccoon family. "We'll figure this out," he told Clara, unsure if he was reassuring her or himself. "Come morning, we'll find a way down to the fire road. Hank will have alerted emergency services by then. They'll be looking for me." The question of what would happen to Clara and her cubs in that scenario remained unspoken. Raccoons weren't endangered. They weren't even uncommon in these forests. Standard wildlife protocol would dictate separation. The cubs to a rehabilitation facility. Clara returned to the wild once her wound healed. The thought created a hollow sensation in Robert's chest that had nothing to do with hunger or cold. As if sensing his thoughts, Clara abandoned her cubs temporarily to approach Robert again. She studied his face with unnerving intensity, then deliberately placed her paw on his knee. The gesture felt like communication, like reassurance offered rather than sought. "You're something special, aren't you?" Robert murmured, resisting the urge to touch her in return, respecting the boundaries that still existed despite their unusual connection. "Dad knew it, spent his life trying to prove it, and I dismissed him right up until the end." The memory of their last conversation surfaced with painful clarity. Thomas excited about new behaviors he'd documented, Robert impatiently cutting him off with scientific objections and thinly veiled embarrassment. "That's not how animal cognition works, Dad. You're seeing what you want to see." The hurt in his father's eyes had stayed with him, an uncomfortable memory he'd buried beneath rationalization and grief. Now, faced with undeniable evidence of exactly what Thomas had described, Robert felt the weight of his dismissal like a physical pain. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered to the storm-filled darkness. "You were right." Clara returned to her cubs, leaving Robert to his thoughts and regrets. He checked his watch. Just past midnight. Hours until dawn would bring enough light to safely navigate the treacherous terrain. Hours to reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment, sheltering with 3 wild raccoons in a storm that had already claimed his home and nearly his life. The raccoon family soon fell into exhausted sleep, their breathing synchronized in the peaceful rhythm of absolute trust. Robert remained awake, serving as sentinel against dangers he could barely define but felt responsible for confronting. His military training resurfaced in this role, the discipline of the watch, the hyper-awareness of surroundings, the subordination of personal comfort to collective security. Around 2 a.m., the storm's character changed. The driving rain softened to a steady downpour, the wind's howl diminishing to an occasional gust. Lightning still flashed across the sky, but the accompanying thunder grew more distant, the storm's center moving eastward across the mountains. Robert allowed himself to hope that the worst had passed. Then came a sound that chilled his blood more effectively than the wet clothing clinging to his skin. The low, rumbling roar of moving water, far louder than the creek's normal flow, even in flood. He knew immediately what it meant. The Westridge Dam had failed. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing the sleeping raccoons, Robert crawled to the edge of their shelter and peered out into the darkness. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The valley below, where his cabin had stood for generations, was now a churning river. The floodwaters had risen far beyond the creek's banks, claiming the entire bottomland in a sweeping tide of destruction. Had they remained in the cabin, they would certainly be dead. Had they taken Hank's route along the ridge road, they might have been caught in the surge. Clara's guidance, her insistence on the uphill path despite its difficulties, had saved their lives. This realization struck Robert with the force of revelation. The raccoon hadn't simply fled uphill on animal instinct. She had made a calculated decision based on knowledge of the landscape and an assessment of relative dangers. She had communicated that decision to him through deliberate, complex behaviors. Most incredibly, she had been right. "My father didn't just document your intelligence," Robert whispered, watching Clara sleep peacefully despite the catastrophe unfolding below. "He was working with you, wasn't he? Learning from you as much as about you." The water's roar grew louder as more of the valley succumbed to the flood. In the occasional lightning flashes, Robert could see debris carried in the current, pieces of structures, fallen trees, the scattered remnants of human habitation reclaimed by nature's overwhelming force. Among the flotsam, something caught his eye. A flash of metal reflecting lightning, moving not with the current, but against it. Straining to see through the darkness, Robert finally identified the object. A rescue boat, its spotlight sweeping methodically across the floodwaters. Emergency services had responded faster than he dared hope. Perhaps Hank had indeed raised the alarm, or perhaps the dam's failure had triggered a broader evacuation effort. Whatever the reason, help was searching the valley. Robert's first instinct was to signal immediately, to shout, to wave, to use the flashlight still secured in his pack. Yet something held him back, a caution born not from fear for himself, but concern for his unusual companions. Standard wildlife protocol would separate them. The cubs would be taken to different facilities based on their conditions. Clara would be treated as a nuisance animal at best, a disease vector at worst. The remarkable intelligence she had demonstrated, the extraordinary behaviors that validated Thomas Mitchell's life work, would be dismissed or ignored by conventional wildlife management. As Robert wrestled with this dilemma, Clara stirred. Her eyes opened, immediately alert, taking in Robert's position and the changed sounds of the storm. She rose carefully, avoiding disturbing her cubs, and joined him at the shelter's edge. Together they watched the rescue boat navigate the treacherous currents, its spotlight illuminating the devastating scope of the flood. When the beam swept near their position on the hillside, Clara deliberately stepped back into the shadows, her behavior suggesting not just caution but understanding of what discovery might mean. "You know, don't you?" Robert whispered. "You understand what they would do." Clara's gaze met his, steady and unblinking. In that moment, Robert made a decision that would alter the course of not just this night, but all the days to follow. He switched off his flashlight and moved deeper into their shelter, choosing not to signal the rescuers below. "We'll find another way," he told Clara, the promise feeling both reckless and absolutely right. Together. The raccoon settled beside him, her warm body a small comfort against the chill that had settled into his bones. As the rescue boat continued its search in the valley below, eventually moving beyond their position, Robert felt the weight of his choice. He had prioritized these animals, this family, over immediate rescue and medical attention. Some would call it foolish, perhaps even evidence of shock or exposure affecting his judgment. Yet in the calm certainty that followed his decision, Robert recognized something his father had tried to explain years ago, that the boundaries between human and animal, between rationality and instinct, were far more permeable than science had acknowledged. That sometimes the most profound understanding came not from study, but from connection. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with the first pale hints of light, Robert finally surrendered to exhaustion. His last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was a memory. His father sitting on the cabin porch, watching a young raccoon investigate a puzzle box he'd constructed, saying words that only now made complete sense. "They're not just surviving in our world, son. They're learning to thrive in it. And maybe, if we're wise enough to see it, we could learn something from them in return." In the soft light of morning, as rescue helicopters began their systematic sweep of the flooded valley, Robert Mitchell slept peacefully beside Clara and her cubs, his choice made, his path altered, his father's legacy secured in the waterproof case pressed against his back, and in the remarkable creatures who had guided him to safety when all human calculations had failed. Robert awoke to silence, a stark contrast to the storm's fury that had defined the previous night. Sunlight filtered through the makeshift shelter, casting dappled patterns across the earthen floor. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind, the unfamiliar surroundings triggering a spike of anxiety before memory returned in a flood of images. The cabin collapsing, the desperate climb, Clara leading them to safety. The raccoon family was gone. Panic surged through him as he scrambled to his feet, muscles protesting after hours on the cold ground. "Clara?" His voice sounded strange in the morning quiet, hoarse from sleep and emotion. "Scout? Patch?" No response came except the distant calls of birds reclaiming the world after the storm's passage. Robert pushed aside the woven branches that had sheltered them, emerging into a landscape transformed by nature's violence. The hillside bore fresh scars where mudslides had carried away vegetation and topsoil. Below, the valley had become an unfamiliar expanse of water where fields and forests once stood. His cabin, the Mitchell family home for generations, was simply gone, erased as thoroughly as a drawing wiped from a chalkboard. The sense of loss hit him with physical force, buckling his knees. Not just the structure and possessions, but the connection to his father, to his past, the photographs and books and mementos that had defined his history, all swept away in a single night of nature's fury. Yet amid this devastation, another loss cut deeper. The raccoons had abandoned him. After everything they'd shared, after the bond he'd thought was forming, they had slipped away while he slept. The rational part of his mind understood. They were wild animals returning to their natural state once danger passed. But his heart ached with a sense of abandonment that surprised him with its intensity. "You're being ridiculous, Mitchell," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his grimy hair. "They're raccoons, not family." Even as he said it, he knew the words were a lie. Something profound had happened during their shared ordeal, something that transcended the traditional boundaries between human and wild. Clara had demonstrated intelligence and decision-making that validated his father's most controversial theories. She had saved his life through deliberate action. That connection couldn't be dismissed as mere anthropomorphism or the desperation of a lonely man. Robert gathered his meager possessions: the backpack containing his father's research drives, a now empty water bottle, the small first aid kit he'd brought from the cabin. The weight of the pack reminded him of his responsibility. Thomas Mitchell's life work, previously dismissed by the scientific community, now rested solely in his hands. The documentation of Clara's family line, the evidence of remarkable cognitive abilities in these raccoons, all of it preserved when everything else had been lost. "At least I saved that much," he told the empty forest. "I owe you that, Dad." Turning his attention to practical matters, Robert assessed his situation with military precision. His location, approximately 2 miles uphill from where his cabin had stood, on the eastern slope of Mitchell Ridge. His condition, cold, hungry, and dehydrated, but without serious injury. His assets, the contents of his pack, the clothes on his back, and his survival training from military service. His objective: reach emergency services without endangering himself or exposing Clara's family to potential capture. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the valley, confirming that rescue operations were underway. From his elevated position, Robert could see at least 2 aircraft sweeping in coordinated patterns across the floodwaters, presumably searching for survivors. Under normal circumstances, his priority would be making himself visible to these rescuers. Instead, he found himself calculating a route that would take him to emergency services without revealing where he'd spent the night or the existence of Clara's unusual family. The fire road that crossed the ridge approximately a mile north would be his best option, likely passable despite the storm, and a natural place for a survivor to emerge. As Robert began picking his way carefully across the storm-damaged hillside, movement caught his eye. A flash of ringed tail disappearing behind a fallen tree about 30 yards ahead. His heart leaped before reason could temper his reaction. "Clara?" He approached the spot cautiously, hope warring with the likelihood of disappointment. Rounding the tree trunk, he found not Clara but Scout, the healthy cub, apparently foraging for breakfast among the storm debris. The young raccoon froze at Robert's appearance, natural wariness temporarily overriding the trust established during their ordeal. "Hey there, little guy," Robert said softly, crouching to appear less threatening. "Where's your mom? Where's your brother?" Scout chittered softly, head tilting as if considering Robert's questions. Then, with deliberate movement that could not be mistaken for random animal behavior, the cub turned and moved several paces away before looking back expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" The cub chittered again, more insistently. Robert straightened, adjusting his pack. "Lead on, then." Scout led him on a winding path through the forest, occasionally pausing to ensure Robert kept pace. They traversed terrain that would have been challenging under the best circumstances, made treacherous now by saturated soil and storm debris. Yet the cub navigated with confidence, selecting routes that accommodated Robert's larger size and lesser agility. After approximately 15 minutes, they reached a small clearing dominated by a massive Douglas fir that had partially uprooted during the storm. Its enormous root ball had torn free from the earth, creating a sheltered cavity beneath the trunk. From this natural fortress came familiar chittering, Clara's distinctive vocalizations. "Clara," Robert called softly, approaching the opening. The mother raccoon emerged cautiously, her intelligent eyes immediately focusing on Robert with what he could only interpret as recognition. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, lay Patch. The injured cub appeared motionless. "Oh, no," Robert whispered, heart sinking. "Is he—" Clara moved aside, creating space for Robert to approach. Kneeling beside the fallen tree, he peered into the shadows where Patch lay. To his immense relief, the cub's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He was alive, but clearly struggling. The splint Robert had applied remained intact, but the cub's condition had deteriorated overnight, likely a combination of shock, exposure, and the infection that had been present before the storm. "He needs antibiotics," Robert muttered, more to himself than to Clara, "and proper medical care." The dilemma facing him sharpened into painful clarity. To save Patch would require resources Robert no longer possessed. Medications washed away with the cabin, veterinary expertise he couldn't access without revealing the raccoons to authorities, yet leaving the cub to suffer a slow death seemed equally impossible. As Robert wrestled with this impossible choice, Clara did something that left him speechless. She reached into a small cache of objects gathered in the corner of the root cavity and extracted a familiar orange prescription bottle which she carried carefully to Robert. His heart nearly stopped when he read the label. Antibiotics from his own emergency kit, which he'd used to treat Patch initially. Clara must have taken them before abandoning their storm shelter, anticipating their continued need. The bottle still contained several tablets. Words failed him. This wasn't just tool use or problem solving. This was foresight, planning, understanding of cause and effect across time. You knew he'd need these. Clara placed the bottle in his open palm, then returned to Patch's side, chittering softly as if encouraging Robert to proceed. "Okay," he said, gathering his composure. "Let's try to help him." Robert crushed a tablet between two smooth stones, dissolving the powder in water from a small depression filled with clean rainwater. Using the eyedropper from his first aid kit, he carefully administered the makeshift medication to Patch, who swallowed reflexively despite his weakened state. "That's the best I can do for now," Robert told Clara, repacking his supplies, "but he needs more than I can give him here." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, indicating the search pattern had shifted closer to their position. Robert glanced upward through gaps in the canopy, calculating. If he intended to reach emergency services without revealing the raccoons, he needed to move soon. Clara seemed to understand his divided attention. She moved between her injured cub and the forest beyond, chittering in what sounded remarkably like distress. "I know," Robert said softly. "I don't want to leave you either, but I can't stay here, and I don't know how to help Patch without proper supplies." The ethical complexity of the situation weighed on him. These weren't ordinary wild animals that would be better off left alone. Clara's family represented something remarkable, living proof of his father's theories about advanced cognition in certain raccoon populations. More than that, they had formed a connection with Robert that defied conventional understanding of human-wildlife interactions. Yet intervention carried its own risks. Taking them to authorities meant separation at best, euthanasia at worst. Wildlife rehabilitation centers weren't equipped to recognize or accommodate the unusual intelligence these animals displayed. They would be treated as ordinary raccoons. Clara released once her wound healed, the cubs raised with minimal human contact until old enough for release. "There has to be another way," Robert muttered, pacing the small clearing. The helicopter's sounds intensified suddenly, accompanied by the crackle of a loudspeaker too distant to make out words but clear enough to indicate that rescuers had spotted something of interest nearby. Time was running out. Clara made the decision for him. She emerged fully from the root cavity, nudging Scout back inside with firm chittering that brooked no argument. Then, with movements that seemed deliberate in their slowness, she approached Robert and placed her paw on his hand, the same gesture of connection she'd offered in the cabin. "You want me to go," Robert interpreted, throat tight with emotion, "to save myself." Clara held his gaze, then turned to look meaningfully at Patch before returning her attention to Robert. The message seemed clear. "Help yourself first, then help us if you can." "I'll come back," Robert promised, the words emerging before he'd fully processed their implications. "I don't know how yet, but I'll find a way to help Patch." "To help all of you," Clara chittered softly, then retreated to her cubs, her behavior suggesting neither agreement nor disagreement, but simple acceptance of their separate paths. Robert stood, shouldering his pack with renewed determination. "Your father was right about them," he told the memory of Thomas Mitchell, "and I'm going to prove it." With a final glance at the raccoon family sheltered beneath the fallen tree, Robert began making his way toward the fire road where rescuers would most likely be searching. Each step felt like abandonment, yet he understood now that his greatest chance of helping Clara and her cubs lay in his own survival and recovery. The journey proved more challenging than anticipated. What should have been a 40-minute hike stretched into 2 hours of careful navigation around washouts and fallen trees. By the time Robert caught sight of the fire road, his strength was flagging dangerously, dehydration and exposure taking their toll. The road itself had suffered damage but remained passable in sections. Robert followed it eastward toward where emergency vehicles would most likely establish access. After another mile of increasingly difficult walking, he spotted what he'd been hoping for. A county sheriff's SUV parked at a junction, its lights flashing as officers coordinated with rescue personnel via radio. "Hey!" Robert called, voice cracking with effort. "Over here!" The officers responded immediately, rushing to assist what was clearly a flood survivor in distress. Robert felt hands supporting him, voices asking questions about his condition, his identity, whether others were with him. The world began to blur around the edges as exhaustion claimed its due. "Mitchell," he managed. "Robert Mitchell. My cabin was on the creek. I got out before it collapsed." "Mr. Mitchell, we need to get you to medical attention," a female officer informed him, helping him toward the vehicle. "You're suffering from exposure and dehydration." "I'm fine," Robert insisted, though his body betrayed him by stumbling. "Just need some water and rest." "You need a hospital," the officer countered firmly. "We've been searching for survivors since the dam failed last night. You're lucky to be alive." As they helped him into the SUV, Robert clutched his backpack tightly against his chest. "This stays with me," he insisted with unexpected vehemence. "It's important research. My father's work." The officers exchanged glances that suggested they were humoring a man whose judgment might be compromised by trauma, but they allowed him to keep the pack. As the vehicle began navigating the damaged road toward the nearest accessible medical facility, Robert gazed out the window at the devastated landscape. "How bad is it?" he asked, dreading the answer. "Bad," the driver replied grimly. "Westridge Dam completely failed around midnight. 7 confirmed casualties so far, dozens missing, hundreds displaced. Your neighbor Hank Wilson reported you missing when he couldn't convince you to evacuate with him." "Hank made it out okay?" "Yes, sir. Man was pretty torn up about leaving you behind. Kept saying something about raccoons, though nobody could make much sense of that part." Robert chose his next words carefully. "There was wildlife I was concerned about. Couldn't just leave them to drown." The female officer patted his shoulder sympathetically. "That's admirable, Mr. Mitchell, but you nearly died trying to save some animals that would have found their own way to safety. Wild creatures have survived floods long before humans started building cabins in their territory." "These were different," Robert murmured, too exhausted to explain further. The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of fatigue and disconnected observations. The valley transformed into a disaster zone, with emergency vehicles, news crews, and rescue operations visible wherever floodwaters had receded enough to allow access. Temporary shelters had been established at the high school and community center in Pinecrest, their parking lots filled with displaced residents and emergency personnel. By the time they reached the field hospital set up at the county fairgrounds, Robert was drifting in and out of consciousness. Medical staff transferred him to a gurney, voices calling for IV fluids and assessment for hypothermia. Someone tried to take his backpack, triggering a surge of desperate energy. "No!" Robert clutched the pack tighter. "It stays with me. Promise me it stays with me." "Sir, we need to treat you," a nurse explained patiently. "The bag will be safe in storage." "It's evidence," Robert insisted, summoning his most authoritative tone from military service. "Scientific research. Irreplaceable." Whether from respect for his obvious distress or simple expediency, they relented, placing the pack beside his gurney as they wheeled him into a treatment area. The world dissolved into a series of medical procedures. Needle pricks, blood pressure cuffs, thermal blankets, concerned voices discussing his condition in technical terms that his trained ear recognized as serious but not critical. Through it all, Robert's thoughts remained with Clara and her cubs, particularly Patch with his worsening infection. Had the antibiotic helped? Could the injured cub survive without further intervention? The questions circled in his mind like vultures, refusing to grant him peace even as exhaustion dragged him toward unconsciousness. "You're going to be fine, Mr. Mitchell," a doctor assured him as darkness crept into the edges of his vision. "You're dehydrated and suffering mild hypothermia, but nothing we can't fix with fluids and rest." "I need to go back," Robert mumbled, fighting to remain awake. "Have to help them." The doctor exchanged glances with a nurse. "I'm afraid your home is gone, sir. The flood destroyed everything along Mitchell Creek." "Not the cabin," Robert tried to explain, words slurring as medication entered his system through the IV. "The raccoons. Clara and her cubs. Patch is sick. He's delirious," the doctor noted quietly to the nurse. "Let's get his core temperature up and reassess mental status in an hour." As medication pulled him into darkness, Robert's last conscious thought was a renewed promise to the remarkable animals who had saved his life. "I will find you again. I will help you. I will prove what you are." Days later, Robert sat on the edge of a hospital bed, fully dressed in donated clothing, waiting for discharge paperwork. His physical recovery had progressed rapidly, the resilience of a former soldier serving him well despite age and the trauma of his experience. What troubled the medical staff more was his continued insistence on returning to the disaster zone to search for what they interpreted as imaginary or anthropomorphized wildlife. "Mr. Mitchell," Dr. Sanderson began carefully, clipboard in hand, "I understand you're eager to leave, but I'm concerned about some of your statements regarding these raccoons." Robert met the doctor's gaze steadily. "I understand how it sounds. Believe me, I do. But what I experienced wasn't delirium or trauma response. These animals demonstrated cognitive abilities that science hasn't documented before. My father spent 30 years studying them." "Yes, you've mentioned your father's research," Sanderson replied, his tone suggesting he was humoring a patient. "The data you've been so protective of in your backpack. Data that proves I'm not imagining things," Robert countered, frustration building. How could he make them understand without revealing information that might endanger Clara's family? "Look, I know what traumatic bonding looks like. This wasn't that." The doctor sighed, making a notation on his clipboard. "We're recommending a psychiatric follow-up as part of your recovery plan. The loss of your home, combined with the isolation you experienced before the flood, creates a psychological profile that—" "I don't need psychiatric help," Robert interrupted firmly. "I need to get back to the area where I last saw those raccoons. One of them was injured and needed medical intervention." "Wildlife services are handling animal rescue in the flood zone," Sanderson explained patiently. "If there are injured animals, they'll find them and provide appropriate care." That was exactly what Robert feared. Appropriate care that failed to recognize Clara's family as anything other than ordinary wildlife. Standard protocol would separate them permanently, erasing the very connection that made them scientifically extraordinary. "When can I leave?" he asked, instead of arguing further. "Your discharge papers are being processed now," Sanderson replied, seemingly relieved by the change in subject. "Your neighbor, Mr. Wilson, has offered to pick you up. He's arranged temporary housing for you at his property." The news startled Robert. "Hank? Hank Wilson is giving me a place to stay? He's been quite concerned about you. Visited yesterday while you were sleeping." This unexpected development complicated matters further. Hank's attitude toward raccoons was well established. He considered them vermin, pests, to be eliminated. Living under his roof while attempting to locate and help Clara's family would require a level of deception Robert wasn't sure he could maintain. Yet he had few alternatives. His cabin was gone, along with his vehicle and most of his possessions. Insurance would eventually provide funds for rebuilding, but that process would take months. His modest savings would cover temporary accommodations elsewhere, but remaining close to the flood zone, close to where he'd last seen Clara, required local knowledge and access that Hank could provide. "Please thank Mr. Wilson for me," Robert said finally. "I appreciate his offer." When Hank arrived an hour later, the awkwardness between them was palpable. The older man stood uncomfortably in the doorway of the hospital room, cap in hand, eyes taking in Robert's diminished appearance with poorly concealed concern. "You look like hell, Mitchell," he offered by way of greeting. "Feel better than I look," Robert replied with a ghost of a smile. "Thanks for coming, and for the place to stay." Hank shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "Got that old hunting cabin on my back 40. Nobody's used it in years, but it's got a roof and running water. Figure you can stay there while you sort things out with insurance and such." The irony wasn't lost on Robert. A hunting cabin as sanctuary for a man determined to protect wildlife. Yet he recognized the genuine decency behind the offer, especially given their historically strained relationship. "I appreciate it," he said simply. As they walked toward the hospital exit, Hank cleared his throat awkwardly. "About that night at your place, those raccoons you were protecting." Robert tensed. unsure where this conversation was heading, but prepared to defend his actions if necessary. "Never seen anything like that female," Hank continued, voice lowered as if confessing something shameful. "The way she looked at you, the way she acted, wasn't natural." "No," Robert agreed cautiously. "It wasn't." Hank held the door, allowing Robert to pass through before adding, "Your daddy wasn't as crazy as folks made him out to be, was he?" The question hung between them, offering a tentative bridge across years of disagreement. Robert stepped onto it carefully. "No, he wasn't. And I think I owe both of you an apology for not seeing that sooner." They walked in silence to Hank's mud-splattered truck, each man lost in his own thoughts about what had been lost and what, perhaps, had been found in the storm's devastating passage. As they drove away from the hospital, Robert clutched his backpack containing Thomas Mitchell's research, the scientific validation of Clara's remarkable nature, and the key to fulfilling his promise to find her family again. What he couldn't know then was how difficult keeping that promise would prove to be, or how completely the attempt would transform not just his own life, but the understanding of the complex, intelligent creatures his father had recognized when no one else would see. 3 months passed like a slow healing wound. Spring arrived in the Oregon coastal forest, transforming muddy devastation into tentative renewal as wildflowers pushed through silt deposits and new growth softened the stark lines of storm damage. Throughout Pinecrest Valley, reconstruction efforts continued day and night, homes rebuilt, roads repaired, lives slowly reassembled from the fragments left behind. For Robert Mitchell, recovery followed a more complicated path. The hunting cabin on Hank Wilson's property had become a temporary home that felt increasingly permanent. Insurance claims moved at glacial pace, delayed by the sheer volume of disaster-related filings and complicated by boundary disputes where the flood had literally redrawn property lines. The modest settlement he'd received so far had gone toward a used truck and essential supplies rather than rebuilding. The cabin itself was primitive but functional. One room with a wood stove, small kitchen, bathroom with temperamental plumbing, and a narrow sleeping loft accessed by ladder. Hunting trophies adorned the walls, their glass eyes seeming to follow Robert with mute accusation as he worked at the rough-hewn table beneath them. Hank had offered to remove them, seeming to understand Robert's discomfort, but Robert had declined. This wasn't his home. He was merely passing through. What consumed his waking hours wasn't reconstruction plans or insurance paperwork, but the contents of his father's backup drives. Thomas Mitchell's research had proven even more extensive than Robert had imagined. 30 years of meticulous documentation, from handwritten field notes converted to digital files to thousands of photographs and videos, capturing behavior that defied conventional understanding of raccoon cognition. Most compelling were the records specific to Clara's lineage. Thomas had identified her grandmother by the distinctive white ear patch and unusual tail rings, documenting 4 generations of what he termed accelerated adaptive intelligence in this particular family line. The behaviors he'd recorded included tool use, causal reasoning, cooperative problem-solving, and even rudimentary symbolic communication through consistent gestures. Cultural transmission, Thomas had written in his notes, knowledge passed not just genetically but through active teaching between generations. The implications are revolutionary. Robert's throat had tightened reading those words, so similar to what he'd said himself after witnessing Clara's extraordinary behavior. His father had been right all along, and Robert had dismissed his work as the obsession of an aging man who'd spent too many years alone in the woods. The evidence was undeniable, yet organizing it into a format that would convince the scientific community proved challenging. Robert had no academic credentials in biology or animal behavior. His father's methodology, while thorough, didn't always follow standard research protocols. Without Clara and her family to provide new observations, the documentation remained tantalizingly incomplete, compelling but not conclusive by rigorous scientific standards. This professional challenge paled beside the personal one that haunted Robert's dreams and drove him into the forest at every opportunity. Despite dozens of expeditions to the area where he'd last seen Clara's family, despite setting up feeding stations and trail cameras, he'd found no sign of them. The last image he carried was of Clara sheltering her cubs beneath the fallen Douglas fir, Patch's condition deteriorating, Scout watching with unusual solemnity as Robert walked away. Had Patch survived the infection? Had Clara found adequate shelter during the remaining winter months? Had wildlife officials captured them during rescue operations? These questions circled endlessly, finding no resolution in the silent forest or the data on his father's drives. "You heading out again?" Hank asked from the doorway, startling Robert from his contemplation of maps spread across the table. Despite their historical differences, a cautious friendship had developed between the two men, built on shared experience of the flood and grudging mutual respect. "Thought I'd try the North Ridge today," Robert replied, tracing the route with his finger. "There's a series of rock formations that might provide good den sites." Hank leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable beneath his ever-present cap. At 65, he remained remarkably vigorous, though the flood had carved new lines into his weathered face and added silver to his beard. "Been 3 months, Mitchell. If they survived, they've moved on. That's what wild things do." Robert continued studying the map, unwilling to meet Hank's gaze. "Clara's different. Her family's different. You saw it yourself that night." "I saw something I can't explain," Hank conceded. "Don't mean you should spend the rest of your life chasing after it." The concern in his neighbor's voice was genuine, which made it harder to dismiss. The truth was, Robert's obsession with finding Clara had begun to define his post-flood existence, overshadowing practical considerations like permanent housing or resuming his photography career. Somewhere in the past months, proving his father right and finding the remarkable Raccoon family had become intertwined with his sense of purpose, perhaps even his identity. "It's not just about finding them," Robert tried to explain, gathering his field equipment. "It's about validating my father's work, about scientific discovery." Hank snorted softly. "Sure it is. And I suppose the way you talk about that mama raccoon like she's a long-lost friend is just scientific objectivity." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth. Robert had indeed begun thinking of Clara not as a research subject, but as something closer to a colleague or companion, an intelligent being with whom he'd shared extraordinary circumstances and formed a connection that defied conventional categories. "I just need to know they're all right," Robert admitted, abandoning pretense, "especially Patch. He was so sick when I left them." Hank studied him silently for a moment, then nodded as if reaching some internal decision. "Forest Service called yesterday. Ranger Collins wants you to call her back. Something about unusual wildlife activity up by the old fire lookout." Robert's heart leaped. "What kind of activity?" "Didn't say. Just that it reminded her of those stories your daddy used to tell." Without another word, Robert grabbed his phone and stepped outside to make the call, hands trembling slightly as he dialed the ranger station. Emily Collins had been one of the few local officials who'd taken Thomas Mitchell's wildlife observations seriously, occasionally accompanying him on field expeditions despite skepticism from her colleagues. If she was making a connection to his father's work, it warranted immediate attention. "Ranger Collins, it's Robert Mitchell. Hank said you called about wildlife activity." Emily's voice came through clearly, professional but warm. "Robert, yes. I was up at Eagle Point Lookout yesterday doing post-flood habitat assessment. Found something you should see. Possibly related to those raccoons you were asking about back in February." Robert's grip tightened on the phone. "What did you find?" "Better if you see for yourself. I'm heading back up there tomorrow morning." Can you meet me at the North Trailhead around 8? I'll be there, Robert promised, hope surging through him for the first time in weeks. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect conditions for the steep hike to Eagle Point. The fire lookout tower had been decommissioned decades ago, but remained a popular destination for hikers seeking panoramic views of the coastal range. Robert arrived at the trailhead early, equipment packed and ready, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still as he waited for Emily. The ranger arrived precisely at 8, her Forest Service truck raising dust on the access road. At 40, Emily Collins embodied the practical competence of someone who'd spent her career in the outdoors, lean, sun-weathered, movements economical and purposeful. She greeted Robert with a firm handshake and a praising look. "You're looking better than last time I saw you," she observed, referring to their brief meeting at the emergency shelter during flood recovery. "Ready for a climb?" "More than ready," Robert assured her, shouldering his pack. "What exactly did you find up there?" Emily began walking toward the trailhead, setting a brisk pace. "Let's just say it's the kind of thing your father would have documented extensively. And the reason I called you instead of filing an official report." The cryptic response heightened Robert's curiosity, but he recognized the ranger's professional caution. Wildlife management involved politics as much as science, especially when unusual behaviors might trigger disruptive intervention protocols. If Emily was circumventing official channels, she had good reason. They hiked in companionable silence, the trail winding upward through forest, recovering from both winter dormancy and flood damage. Twice they detoured around washouts where the path had been undermined, Emily pointing out fresh survey markers indicating future repairs. The Forest Service, like everyone else in the region, was still cataloging the storm's extensive impact. 2 hours of steady climbing brought them to Eagle Point, where the steel frame of the old lookout tower stood like a sentinel against the sky. The 360-degree views justified the exertion. Forested ridges rolling toward the distant Pacific, the scarred valley below where floodwaters had carved new channels through the landscape, and the skeletal remains of Westridge Dam visible as a broken tooth in the eastern distance. "Over here," Emily directed, leading Robert not to the tower, but to a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards to the north. "Watch your step, and keep your voice down." Robert followed carefully, anticipation building with each footfall. The boulder formation created a natural enclosure, partially sheltered by overhanging rock and accessed through narrow passages between the stones. Emily stopped at one such passage, gesturing for Robert to look inside. What he saw stole his breath completely. The enclosure contained what could only be described as a deliberate arrangement of found objects. Strips of tarp and plastic sheeting had been woven between branches to create a waterproof roof over one section. Beneath this shelter lay a bed of carefully arranged cedar boughs. Various containers, discarded bottles, tin cans, even a battered cooking pot had been positioned to catch rainwater. Most remarkably, a collection of human-made objects had been gathered and organized by apparent function. Tools in one area, medical supplies in another, food containers in a third. "What am I looking at?" Robert whispered, though he already suspected the answer. "I've been working these forests for 18 years, Emily replied quietly. "Never seen anything like it. Bears don't build structures, cougars don't collect tools, but your father used to tell stories." "About raccoons with unusual cognitive abilities," Robert completed her thought. "About problem-solving and construction behaviors that shouldn't be possible for Procyon lotor." Emily nodded. "I always thought he was exaggerating, seeing patterns where coincidence existed. But this—" She gestured toward the carefully constructed shelter. "This is deliberate, planned, executed with understanding of materials and purpose." "Clara," Robert breathed, heart pounding. "It has to be her family." "Clara?" "The mother raccoon I told you about. The one with the white ear patch." Emily's expression shifted subtly. You named her. My father did, Robert corrected, though it wasn't entirely true. Thomas had documented the distinctive raccoon but had used identification numbers rather than names in his research. The personal name had been Robert's contribution, born from the connection forged during the flood. There's more, Emily said, leading him around to another entrance in the boulder formation. This is what convinced me to call you instead of my supervisor. The second enclosure contained something even more extraordinary. What appeared to be a rudimentary map created from arranged pebbles, twigs, and leaves. With a jolt of recognition, Robert realized it depicted the major landmarks of the valley. The creek rendered in small white stones, the ridge and twigs of graduating heights, the cabin location marked by a flattened piece of metal that might once have been part of a tin roof. It's a representation, Robert said, awe evident in his voice. A symbolic model of the landscape. Emily nodded slowly. Your father claimed these particular raccoons had developed representational cognition, the ability to understand that objects can stand for other things. I didn't believe him. Couldn't believe him. That level of abstract thinking isn't supposed to exist in non-primates. Yet here it is, Robert gestured to the makeshift map. Undeniable evidence. Evidence of something, Emily qualified, professional caution reasserting itself. I'm not saying I fully accept your father's theories, but I'm open to the possibility that there's more happening here than conventional wildlife biology can explain. Robert knelt beside the stone map, examining it more closely. The arrangement wasn't just geographically accurate. It included temporal information as well. Darker stones formed a path from the cabin location up the ridge, the route Robert and Clara had taken during the flood. At the spot corresponding to their shelter beneath the fallen tree, a small circle of red berries had been placed. It's our journey, Robert whispered, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. She documented our escape from the flood. Emily watched him carefully, her expression balanced between scientific interest and concern for his obvious emotional investment. Robert, even if these raccoons are as intelligent as you believe, we need to be careful about anthropomorphizing their behavior. Pattern recognition and tool use don't necessarily indicate human-like consciousness. I know what anthropomorphism looks like, Robert replied, not unkindly. This goes beyond projecting human traits onto animal behavior. This is evidence of cognitive abilities that science has failed to recognize because they don't fit neatly into our understanding of non-human intelligence. He reached into his pack, extracting his father's journal and a tablet containing the digitized research. My father documented 4 generations of this raccoon family. Their behaviors have become more complex over time, suggesting cultural transmission of knowledge rather than just instinctual adaptation. Emily accepted the tablet, scrolling through Thomas Mitchell's meticulous notes and photographs with growing fascination. This is extensive. Why didn't he publish this research formally? He tried, Robert explained, the old frustration evident in his voice. Scientific journals rejected his submissions as methodologically flawed or insufficiently rigorous. Wildlife management agencies dismissed his observations as anthropomorphic projection. He was a self-taught naturalist without academic credentials, easy to ignore despite decades of field experience. And you want to vindicate him? Emily surmised, returning the tablet. Prove he was right all along. Not just for his sake, Robert clarified. Understanding these animals correctly matters for conservation, for habitat protection, for our entire approach to wildlife management. If raccoons can develop this level of cognition, what other capabilities have we missed in species we dismiss as just animals? Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by a sound that stopped Robert's heart momentarily, a familiar chittering from the boulders above them. He looked up slowly, hardly daring to hope, and found himself staring into the intelligent eyes of Clara herself, perched on an overhanging rock with characteristic alertness. "Clara," he whispered, joy and relief flooding through him. "You're alive." The raccoon regarded him steadily, head tilted slightly as if assessing his condition as thoroughly as he was assessing hers. Her coat looked healthy, the gunshot wound on her shoulder healed to a barely visible scar. After a moment of mutual observation, she chittered again, this time directing the sound toward the boulders behind her. Scout appeared immediately, larger than Robert remembered, but unmistakable in his movements and markings. The young raccoon scrambled down the rocks with remarkable agility, stopping at a cautious distance but showing clear recognition in his focused attention. "Is Patch?" Robert couldn't complete the question, fear of the answer closing his throat. As if in response, a third raccoon emerged slowly from between the rocks, smaller than Scout but moving with only a slight favoring of his previously injured leg. Patch had survived, the splint and antibiotics apparently sufficient to allow healing despite the less-than-ideal circumstances. Emily watched this reunion with undisguised amazement. "They recognize you," she said quietly. "They're responding to you specifically, not just to human presence." "We went through something extraordinary together," Robert explained, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening as Clara descended from her perch. "They saved my life during the flood. I tried to save theirs." Clara approached cautiously, maintaining a respectful distance that acknowledged their different species while still allowing interaction. She chittered softly, a communication that Robert couldn't translate literally, but understood emotionally as acknowledgement, perhaps even greeting. "Hello to you too," he responded gently. "I've been looking for you for months." In response, Clara turned and moved deliberately toward the stone map, placing her paw directly on the berry circle that marked their shared shelter during the storm. The gesture was so clearly communicative, so obviously intended to reference their shared experience, that even Emily inhaled sharply in surprise. "That's—" the ranger began, then stopped, professional vocabulary failing to capture what she was witnessing. "That's exactly what my father documented," Robert completed her thought. "Deliberate, symbolic communication, recognition of shared experience across time, use of representational objects to convey meaning." Clara withdrew from the map and returned to her cubs, who had maintained a cautious distance during the interaction. With gentle nudges, she guided them back toward the sheltered enclosure, pausing at the entrance to look back at Robert with what he could only interpret as an invitation. "She wants us to see something else," he told Emily, already moving carefully toward the shelter. "Something important." Inside the enclosure, Clara led them to a small niche in the rock wall, partially concealed by woven branches. With surprising precision, she removed these branches to reveal a cache of objects that Robert recognized immediately. Items from his cabin, preserved despite the flood's destruction. A photograph in a plastic sleeve showing Thomas Mitchell with a much younger Robert, a small first aid kit, presumably the same one Robert had used to treat Patch. Most astonishingly, his father's compass, its brass case, tarnished but intact. "They salvaged these things from the flood," Emily whispered, scientific detachment temporarily abandoned in the face of such extraordinary behavior, "and kept them, protected them." "Not just kept them," Robert corrected, emotion thickening his voice. "Returned them. This is a gift exchange. Reciprocity." Clara watched their reactions with that unnervingly direct gaze, her intelligence apparent not just in her actions, but in her evident understanding of their significance. After allowing them to examine the preserved items, she chittered softly to her cubs, who retreated deeper into the shelter, clearly comfortable with human presence but maintaining appropriate caution. Robert and Emily withdrew respectfully, returning to the open area atop Eagle Point to process what they had witnessed. The ranger's professional composure had given way to genuine wonder, her previous skepticism challenged by direct observation of behaviors that defied conventional wildlife biology. "Your father's research," she began, then paused to organize her thoughts. "It changes everything we think we know about animal cognition, about the boundaries between human and non-human intelligence." "That's what he tried to tell people for 30 years, Robert replied, a complex mixture of vindication, grief, and wonder coloring his words. If he could see this, see Clara teaching her cubs, creating representational models, engaging in reciprocal gift exchange, he'd feel his life's work was validated. Emily considered this, her training as a wildlife professional wrestling with the evidence before her eyes. What happens now? If we report this officially, these raccoons would become research subjects at best, roadside attractions at worst. Neither scenario respects their evident intelligence or autonomy. The question crystallized the dilemma Robert had been wrestling with since discovering his father's complete research. Scientific validation required transparency and replicability. Other researchers would need to observe and document these behaviors independently. Yet exposing Clara's family to institutional study risked exactly the kind of intervention that might destroy the natural development of their remarkable abilities. "I don't know," he admitted. "My father faced this same question and chose protection over publicity. He documented everything meticulously but kept the exact location and identity of these raccoons private, sharing his observations without compromising their safety. That approach cost him scientific recognition," Emily pointed out. "The academic community dismissed his work because they couldn't verify his observations directly." Robert nodded, gazing toward the boulder formation where Clara and her cubs had retreated. Some things matter more than recognition. He understood that eventually. Took me longer to figure it out. As they began the descent from Eagle Point, Robert felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, not the burden of his promise to find Clara, which had now been fulfilled, but the deeper weight of doubt about his father's life work. Thomas Mitchell hadn't been a delusional old man seeing intelligence where none existed. He'd been a pioneer recognizing cognitive abilities that science wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. "I have a proposition," Emily said as they neared the trailhead. "The Forest Service is planning to restrict access to this area for habitat recovery. I could ensure that restriction includes the Eagle Point section, citing sensitive wildlife without specifying species. Creating a protected area without drawing attention to Clara specifically," Robert realized, appreciating the elegant solution. "That would give them space to develop naturally without human interference." "Except yours," Emily added pointedly. "I'm not naive enough to think you'll stay away now that you've found them." Robert couldn't deny it. "I need to document their behavior properly. Continue my father's work with modern methodology that will stand up to scientific scrutiny. But on their terms, not ours. Then we have an understanding." Emily extended her hand, the gesture formalizing their unusual agreement. "I protect the habitat officially. You document the behavior responsibly. Together, we advance the science without endangering the subjects." As they parted ways at the trailhead, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced since before the flood. A sense of direction, of purpose, extending beyond mere survival. Clara and her family weren't just living proof of his father's theories. They represented an opportunity to bridge the artificial divide between human and non-human intelligence, to expand humanity's understanding of the cognitive diversity that existed beyond our limited perceptions. The drive back to Hank's property passed in contemplative silence, the forest around him seeming somehow different now that he knew what intelligence it harbored. When he arrived at the hunting cabin, he found Hank on the porch whittling a piece of cedar with the patient precision of a man accustomed to working with his hands. "Find what you were looking for?" the older man asked without looking up from his work. Yes, Robert replied simply. They're alive, all of them. Hank nodded, as if this confirmation was expected rather than surprising. Good. Maybe now you can start thinking about your own living arrangements instead of theirs. The blunt assessment was typical Hank, gruff but not unkind, practical to a fault. Yet something in his tone suggested he understood more than he let on about Robert's connection to these unusual animals. Actually, I've been thinking about that, Robert said, settling into the chair beside his reluctant host. The insurance settlement should come through next month. Been considering rebuilding, but not at the old cabin site. Creek's changed course anyway, Hank observed. That bottomland won't be stable for years. I was thinking about that parcel up on the ridge, the one that borders your north property line and the national forest, higher ground, good southern exposure, close enough to town for internet access but far enough out for privacy. Hank's hands stilled on his whittling. That's mighty close to Eagle Point. Robert met his gaze steadily, realizing that Hank knew exactly why the location appealed to him. Good hiking up that way. Good wildlife photography opportunities. A moment of silent understanding passed between them, acknowledgement without confession, support without sentimentality. Finally, Hank returned to his carving, the knife making delicate, precise cuts in the soft cedar. Land's reasonable priced since the flood, he observed casually. Might even help you clear some of it come building time. I'd appreciate that, Robert replied, recognizing the offer for what it was, not just practical assistance but tacit approval of his unusual mission. As evening settled over the forest, Robert unpacked his father's research materials on the rough-hewn table, arranging them beside his own notes from the day's extraordinary discovery. Thomas Mitchell's meticulous documentation spanning decades alongside Robert's nascent observations, a continuation, a legacy, a vindication. For the first time since the flood, perhaps for the first time since his father's death years earlier, Robert felt a profound sense of rightness about his path forward. Clara and her family had survived nature's fury, not just through instinct, but through intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability. In doing so, they had helped him survive as well, not just physically during the storm, but emotionally in its aftermath, providing purpose when purpose seemed lost. Tomorrow, he would begin organizing his father's research into a format that might finally receive the scientific attention it deserved. He would develop a methodology for documenting Clara's family without disrupting their natural development. He would design a home that served both human needs and research requirements, a base for the work that would likely consume the remainder of his life. But tonight, he simply sat in quiet contemplation of the remarkable truth he had witnessed, that intelligence, compassion, and connection existed beyond the boundaries humans had drawn around themselves in the mind of a raccoon who had saved his life, and then, against all odds and expectations, welcomed him back into hers. The Ridge House stood complete 1 year after the flood, its cedar siding weathering to a natural silver gray that blended harmoniously with the surrounding forest. Unlike the generations-old cabin that had been lost to the waters, this structure had been designed with purpose rather than inherited by chance. Large windows facing south to capture light and warmth, a wraparound porch offering 270-degree views of the valley, and a dedicated workspace where photography equipment shared space with research materials. Robert Mitchell stood on that porch now, morning coffee steaming in his hand as he watched sunrise paint the distant mountains in shades of amber and gold. At 59, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had found his purpose after years of searching. The past 12 months had transformed him physically as well as spiritually. The manual labor of building had strengthened his body, while regular hiking to Eagle Point had improved his endurance. Even the nightmares that had plagued him since his military service had diminished, replaced by dreams of forest paths and intelligent eyes watching from the shadows. "Morning comes earlier every day," he observed to the raccoon perched comfortably on the porch railing. Clara had arrived just before dawn, a pattern established over months of cautious interaction. She never entered the house uninvited, maintaining the boundary between wild and domestic with characteristic intelligence, yet she had clearly incorporated Robert's homestead into her territory. Clara chittered softly in response, her attention divided between Robert and the forest beyond, where her now adolescent cubs were likely foraging. Scout and Patch had grown into healthy young adults, their distinctive markings making them easily identifiable among the local raccoon population. They visited less frequently than their mother, maintaining greater distance from human contact, which Robert considered a healthy development for wild animals regardless of their unusual cognitive abilities. "Let's see what we got today," Robert said, setting down his coffee and retrieving the small digital camera mounted under the porch eave. This was part of their morning ritual, reviewing footage captured overnight by the network of unobtrusive wildlife cameras he'd installed on his property. Unlike traditional research setups designed to simply document animal movements, Robert's system focused on specific areas where Clara's family had demonstrated problem-solving behaviors. The previous night's footage proved particularly interesting. Clara's extended family group, now including her sister's offspring and several unrelated raccoons, had collaborated to solve a complex puzzle box Robert had constructed based on his father's designs. The box contained fruit and nuts, accessible only through a sequence of manipulations requiring cooperation among multiple individuals. What made the footage remarkable wasn't just their success, but their method. Clear evidence of teaching, with Clara demonstrating techniques to younger raccoons, who then practiced under her supervision. "We're going to need more storage space for all this documentation," Robert told Clara, who watched the small screen with what appeared to be genuine interest. "At this rate, we'll have enough evidence to publish preliminary findings by winter." The question of publication remained complicated. After months of organizing his father's research and supplementing it with his own observations, Robert had reconnected with several of his former wildlife photography contacts, carefully feeling out potential scientific collaborators. Dr. Elaine Foster at Oregon State University had shown particular interest, visiting the property twice to observe Clara's family from a distance. Her expertise in cognitive ethology would lend crucial credibility to any formal presentation of the research. "Dr. Foster's coming back next week," Robert informed Clara, who had moved to investigate the bowl of blackberries he'd set out. "She's bringing her graduate student this time. Think you might be willing to demonstrate that tool use sequence again? Really impressed her last time." Clara selected a berry with deliberate care, her dexterous paws handling the fruit with remarkable precision. Robert had long since stopped questioning whether she understood his words specifically. What mattered was that she comprehended context, intention, and relationship in ways that transcended language barriers. The sound of tires on gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Clara immediately tensed, berry forgotten as she assessed potential threat. When Hank's familiar truck came into view, she relaxed slightly but moved to a more elevated position on the porch roof, maintaining line of sight while increasing safety distance, a behavior Robert had documented dozens of times as evidence of complex risk assessment. "Morning, Mitchell," Hank called as he climbed stiffly from the truck. At 66, arthritis had begun to limit his mobility, though he refused to acknowledge this limitation in any way beyond an occasional grimace. "Saw your lights on early. Figured you might have coffee going." "Always do," Robert replied, retrieving a second mug from inside. Their unlikely friendship had deepened over the past year, tempered by the shared experience of the flood and strengthened through the collaborative effort of building Robert's new home. While they still disagreed fundamentally about many things, politics, environmental policy, the proper way to grill a steak, they had achieved a mutual respect that transcended these differences. Hank settled into one of the Adirondack chairs with a barely suppressed groan, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. His gaze moved immediately to Clara's position overhead, acknowledgment rather than surprise in his expression. "Your lady friends here early today?" he observed, using the term he'd adopted for Clara after witnessing her unusual intelligence firsthand during a particularly memorable encounter months earlier. "Those cubs of hers around too?" "Not yet," Robert replied, resuming his own seat. "Probably out foraging. They've been expanding their territory since spring." Hank sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Saw some new folks up by Eagle Point yesterday. Hikers with fancy gear. One had a camera with a lens long as my arm." The information carried a warning that Robert didn't miss. Despite Emily Collins' efforts to keep the area's unique wildlife relatively protected through habitat management restrictions, word had begun spreading among wildlife enthusiasts about unusual raccoon behavior in the Pinecrest Valley. So far, most visitors were respectful observers rather than disruptive intruders, but increased human attention carried inevitable risks. "I'll mention it to Emily," Robert said. "Might be time for another educational signage campaign about wildlife disturbance." Hank nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. His relationship with Clara's family had evolved from hostile to cautiously respectful, particularly after an incident the previous fall when Scout had alerted him to a rattlesnake near his woodpile, behavior so clearly intentional that even Hank couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. "That university lady coming back?" he asked, changing the subject. "Next week. She's bringing a graduate student this time. Moving forward with that paper you mentioned?" Robert nodded, appreciating Hank's interest, despite the older man's general skepticism toward academic pursuits. "Starting the process needs to be handled carefully, presented in a way that advances scientific understanding without creating a circus around Clara specifically." "Good luck with that," Hank replied with characteristic bluntness. "Folks find out there's super smart raccoons living up here, they'll be crawling all over these hills with cameras and raccoon chow." The concern wasn't unfounded. Robert had witnessed firsthand how human fascination with intelligent animals could transform into exploitation. Wildlife tourism that prioritized visitor experience over animal welfare, research that treated subjects as specimens rather than sentient beings. Protecting Clara's family from these potential consequences, while still advancing scientific understanding of their cognitive abilities, required a delicate balance he was still learning to maintain. Their conversation was interrupted by a distinctive vocalization from the forest edge, Scout, announcing his arrival with the complex sequence of chirps and trills that had become his signature communication. Unlike Clara, who had gradually habituated to human presence over months of interaction, Scout maintained a consistent boundary, close enough for observation but always with a clear escape route, never allowing physical contact. Robert respected this choice, recognizing it as evidence of individual personality rather than limitation. "Morning, Scout," he called softly, making no move to approach. "Successful hunting?" The young raccoon chittered in response, circling the clearing before settling on a low branch where he could observe both humans while remaining out of reach. His coat had the glossy quality of prime health, his movements displaying the confident agility of youth in its prime. Robert noted with satisfaction that the healed leg showed no sign of the injury that had nearly claimed his life during the flood. "Still amazes me how they respond to you," Hank observed, keeping his voice low and movements minimal. "Like they know you're talking to them specifically." "They do know," Robert replied with quiet certainty. "Maybe not the exact words, but they understand tone, intent, relationship. My father documented similar recognition patterns across multiple generations. Your daddy would be proud, Hank said after a moment, the simple statement carrying unexpected emotional weight. Seeing you finish what he started. Proving him right when everybody said he was touched in the head. The validation from this unlikely source, a man who had once dismissed Thomas Mitchell as an eccentric old fool, brought a tightness to Robert's throat that made immediate response impossible. Instead, he nodded acknowledgement, attention fixed on Scout, as the young raccoon performed a complex grooming ritual before disappearing back into the forest as quietly as he had arrived. Clara remained on her elevated perch watching this interaction with evident interest. When Scout departed, she descended gracefully to the porch railing again, resuming her inspection of the berry bowl as if the interruption had never occurred. Her comfort in human presence had increased steadily over months of regular interaction, though she maintained clear boundaries that Robert carefully respected. "Got something to show you," Hank said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket to extract a folded newspaper. Local rag ran a story about the flood recovery. Thought you might want to see it. The Pinecrest Valley Gazette was hardly major media, a weekly publication focusing primarily on community events, local government, and high school sports. The article Hank indicated occupied half of page 3, headlined, "1 Year Later, Flood Survivors Rebuild Lives." Beneath a photo of the reconstructed town center was a smaller image that caught Robert's breath. His father's original cabin, taken years before the flood, with Thomas Mitchell standing proudly on the porch. "They interviewed folks who lost homes," Hank explained. "Used your daddy's place as an example of historic properties that couldn't be replaced. Reporter called me asking about you. Told her you were doing just fine, but preferred your privacy." Robert scanned the article, emotion welling as he read the brief paragraph about Thomas Mitchell's contributions to local natural history knowledge. Mitchell was considered eccentric by some, the writer had noted, but his dedication to documenting the region's wildlife created a valuable record of species distribution before the flood altered local habitats. "It's not much," Hank acknowledged, "but it's something, recognition that he mattered to this place." "Thank you," Robert managed, the simple words inadequate for the thoughtfulness behind sharing this small vindication of his father's legacy. He would have appreciated being remembered for his work rather than his reputation. Hank finished his coffee and rose with the careful movements of a man managing constant discomfort. "Got fence repair to finish before the heat sets in. Just wanted to drop that by and check that you're still coming to Laura's birthday dinner Sunday." "Wouldn't miss it," Robert assured him. Laura Wilson, Hank's daughter, had returned to Pinecrest after the flood to help her father recover. Her initial wariness toward Robert, influenced by years of hearing about the eccentric Mitchell family, had gradually transformed into friendship built on shared interest in environmental restoration. Her children, especially 10-year-old William, had become frequent visitors to Robert's Ridge house, fascinated by his wildlife photography and stories. As Hank's truck disappeared down the gravel drive, Robert turned his attention back to Clara, who had remained a patient observer throughout the human interaction. "Just us again," he told her, extending his hand palm up in the gesture they had established for non-threatening communication. "Want to see what the new camera captured by the stream crossing?" Clara chittered softly, moving closer with the deliberate care that characterized her movements around humans. After a moment's consideration, she placed her paw briefly on Robert's outstretched hand, a contact so light it barely registered physically but carried emotional significance that still moved him even after countless repetitions. This wasn't the behavior of a wild animal tolerating human presence. It was communication, acknowledgement, connection. Together, they reviewed footage from the streamside camera, which had captured a remarkable sequence of Clara's extended family using stepping stones to cross rushing water. stones that appeared to have been deliberately positioned to create a safe passage. Robert narrated his observations aloud, pointing out specific behaviors that demonstrated planning, spatial reasoning, and collective problem-solving. "This is exactly what Dad documented 15 years ago," he told Clara, pausing the footage on a frame showing a juvenile raccoon receiving what appeared to be instruction from an older individual. Cultural transmission of knowledge across generations, not just learning through observation, but active teaching. Clara watched the screen with apparent interest, her attention focused on the images of her own species engaged in complex behavior. After several minutes of this shared review, she moved to the porch edge, chittering softly, a sound Robert had come to recognize as a departure signal. He made no move to prevent her leaving, respecting her autonomy as he always did. "See you tomorrow?" he asked, the question purely conversational rather than expectant. Clara paused, looking back at him with that direct, intelligent gaze that had first connected them during the flood. Then, with characteristic grace, she descended from the porch and disappeared into the forest that was her true home. Alone again, Robert returned to his workspace, where the morning's discoveries would be added to the growing body of evidence documenting the remarkable cognitive abilities of Clara's family. The research paper taking shape on his computer represented more than scientific documentation. It was the fulfillment of a promise made to his father's memory, to Clara's trust, and to his own sense of purpose rediscovered in the aftermath of loss. The afternoon passed in focused work, interrupted only by the arrival of Emily Collins, who had begun stopping by regularly to review new observations and discuss conservation strategies. Their professional collaboration had evolved into friendship built on shared commitment to understanding and protecting the unusual raccoon population. "The university team is confirmed for next Thursday," Emily reported, reviewing the footage Robert had captured that morning. "Dr. Foster is bringing her best graduate student, someone she trusts to maintain appropriate scientific discretion." "How much have you told her?" Robert asked, the question reflecting his ongoing concern about balancing scientific transparency with Clara's protection. "Enough to establish the research value, not enough to create unrealistic expectations," Emily replied diplomatically. "She understands this is preliminary observation, not a guaranteed research outcome." They spent the next hour reviewing protocols for the upcoming visit. Observation distances, behavior documentation methods, ethical boundaries to be maintained. Unlike traditional wildlife research that often prioritized data collection over subject welfare, their approach centered respect for Clara's family as sentient beings rather than mere research subjects. "Sometimes I wonder what my father would think of all this," Robert admitted as they concluded their planning. "He spent decades trying to convince the scientific community to take his observations seriously. Now we're being so cautious about sharing the very evidence he sought." Emily considered this thoughtfully. "The world's different now than when your father was doing his initial research. Social media, viral content, invasive tourism. The potential for exploitation is greater. I think he'd approve of protecting these animals first, advancing science second." "You're probably right," Robert agreed. "He always said that understanding without compassion was just data collection, that real knowledge required respect for the subject." After Emily departed, Robert spent the evening organizing research notes and preparing materials for Dr. Foster's visit. The scientific paper taking shape represented years of his father's work combined with his own observations, a comprehensive documentation of cognitive abilities in a specific raccoon population that challenged conventional understanding of non-primate intelligence. As darkness settled over the ridge, Robert stepped onto the porch one final time, scanning the forest edge out of habit. No raccoons appeared, which was typical for evening hours when Clara's family would be actively foraging throughout their territory. Yet he felt their presence nonetheless, not physically, but as a consciousness sharing this landscape, observing and understanding in their own way. The night sky opened above him, stars emerging in familiar patterns unchanged by the flood that had transformed so much else in this valley. Robert Mitchell, once lost in grief and isolation, stood grounded in purpose and connection. To his father's legacy, to this healing landscape, and to a remarkable raccoon who had entered his life during nature's fury and remained through its aftermath, teaching him to see intelligence and compassion beyond the boundaries humans drew around themselves. Morning would bring new observations, new insights, new challenges in balancing scientific discovery with ethical responsibility. For now, he simply stood witness to the night, grateful for the extraordinary journey that had led him to this moment, a journey that began with a desperate raccoon scratching at his door during the worst storm in memory, and continued now as a shared exploration of what it meant to recognize intelligence wherever it might exist, even in the most unexpected places. From the forest beyond, a familiar chittering echoed briefly, Clara's distinctive vocalization carrying through the darkness like a good-night call between old friends who needed no common language to understand one another perfectly. "Good night to you, too," Robert replied softly, smiling as he turned toward the warmth of his home, certain in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of discovery, another chapter in the remarkable story that had begun when a man had let a freezing raccoon and her cubs into his home and found his life transformed in ways no one could have predicted. In the quiet moments of life's later chapters, we often find our greatest purpose where we least expect it. Robert Mitchell's journey from isolated grief to profound connection reminds us that it's never too late to begin again. After losing everything in the flood, his home, his possessions, his sense of direction, Robert discovered that true wealth lies in the connections we forge, even with the most unlikely companions. Clara and her family didn't just survive the storm. They taught Robert that intelligence, compassion, and understanding transcend the boundaries we create between species. Like Robert, many of us have weathered our own floods, loss of loved ones, health challenges, retirement adjustments. Yet these trials can lead us to unexpected joys if we remain open to life's possibilities. His story shows us that our most meaningful contributions often come later in life, when experience and wisdom allow us to see what others miss. What unexpected relationship has brought you joy after a difficult time? Has an animal companion ever seemed to understand you in a way that defied explanation? Share your stories of connection and renewal in the comments below. We heal when we recognize ourselves in each other's journeys.